Well, let me welcome everyone to this workshop on consumers, transparency, and the open internet. I appreciate the turnout. Appreciate Commissioner Copps, Commissioner Baker being here. I'll mention some of the other people who are here in a minute. Let me start by thanking Joel Gurin and Julie Knapp for working so hard to put this together. Joel, of course, is the new, I think I can still say new, chief of our Consumer Bureau. I think you have another week of newness. And Julie Knapp, I don't want to say the opposite of new, but Julie has been an institution at the FCC for so long, as we know, runs our Office of Engineering and Technology. And as you all know, this workshop really brings together two of the core themes that have been at the heart of the work at the Commission, consumers and technology. And so to have Joel and Julie work together in organizing this hearing is just terrific. This workshop is one of a series of workshops on the open internet proceeding that the Commission launched a few months ago, proceeding designed to develop rules to preserve a free and open internet. At its core, the open internet proceeding is about protecting and empowering consumers, preserving users' control over the internet and their internet experience. When we talk about consumers here, by the way, I mean, hopefully this will be something that gets talked about on the panel today, both ordinary consumers who are interacting with the internet at home, but also a kind of class of consumers very interested in the topic we're talking about today, engineers, CTOs, others who want to innovate on the web and are consumers of the internet in that sense. The open internet proceeding is about preserving consumers' freedom to access content and apps of their choosing on the internet, to produce and distribute content, the freedom to innovate without permission. Now, all the principles that we've proposed and that have been the subject of discussion at the various workshops that we've had and that we will have a common purpose to benefit consumers. But there's one principle in particular that I'm sure will get a lot of attention today, and that is the sixth principle that we've proposed, the principle of transparency, a principle that's particularly important for consumer protection and empowerment. And it's particularly important for at least a couple of reasons, in my view. One is making sure that all consumers of the internet have the best information possible will help make markets work most effectively. Will help make sure that it's consumers who are picking winners and losers on the internet. So one, the focus on transparency has that in mind, making the market work, empowering consumers to pick winners and losers. And second, the transparency principle has the opportunity to minimize government involvement in disputes by increasing the chances that with full information, problematic behaviors will be less likely to develop, and that if anything develops, they'll be known about early, and participants in the ecosystem in good faith will have more of a chance to work them out, minimizing government involvement. And so when we think about consumers and transparency in this area and others, those are important frames for how I look at it. And I think it's something the comments just came in, the first round of comments just came into the proceeding, but I think that this point is something that was embraced pretty broadly by many of the filers. I wouldn't pretend that I've read all 120,000 people and organizations that have filed in this proceeding already, but we do know that a large and diverse group of commenters have said that transparency can play a critical role in preserving the internet's openness. We saw many, many different people stand up to make that point. We had a constructive joint filing from Verizon and Google. We've seen in this the growing common ground that is developing and that I think can develop on this issue of such great importance for the country. Consumers and transparency, I should say, since everyone is assembled, it's essential to the open internet proceeding. It's also something that other members of the staff and the Commission are focusing on in other areas of our work. There's been a lot of discussion, and there will continue to be discussion around consumers and transparency as part of our broadband plan. Several months ago, the Commission released a notice of inquiry looking at transparency, information provision across all telecom services. One of the reasons for this is the opportunity that's presented in this area by new information technologies. And there is much less of an excuse now for making sure that consumers have information than there was before, because there are so many different ways that timely, fresh information can be in the hands of consumers and all participants in the marketplace. We have just a terrific group of panelists here today. Thanks to Zach Katz and Joel and Julie for organizing this. Let me note a couple of distinguished participants we have here today and thank them for coming over to the Federal Communications Commission so they can participate. John Leibowitz, the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, is here and will speak and participate. John is an institution in Washington, extremely knowledgeable about consumer issues, transparency issues, the internet, and has made empowering and protecting consumers the core mission of the Federal Trade Commission. We're very pleased to have him here. Very much look forward to his comments. We also have here today the Honorable Conrad von Finkenstein, who is chairman of the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission, the Canadian CRTC, which has been struggling with these issues as well. At all three of our agencies, there's been a lot of work over several years thinking about the consumer and marketplace issues raised by this extraordinary new technology. We're very pleased to have Chairman Finkenstein here participating in this. We have consumer advocates, broadband service providers, content creators, apps providers, developers of transparency and information tools for the internet. I couldn't be more pleased by this panel that we have put together to here. I thank you all for participating, and we're all looking forward to a vibrant, transparent discussion. Let me acknowledge now we have three of my colleagues on the Commission here, Commissioner Copps and Commissioner Clyburn and Commissioner Baker. And we don't have anything scripted, but Commissioner Copps, if you'd like to make a few remarks before we start, would certainly appreciate that. And so as Commissioner Copps comes up, let me thank you all for participating. And again, we look forward to a vibrant discussion today. Commissioner Copps, please.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. I am delighted to be here with our chairman and welcoming all of you to this very important workshop. And I want to acknowledge at the outset the great work that Chairman Janikowski has set in motion here and his leadership in returning this agency to what it's supposed to be, and that is a consumer protection agency. And in that regard, I am really happy to welcome Mr. Leibowitz, Chairman Leibowitz here, who is hard at work on the same job of turning his agency back into what it was always intended to be, a consumer protection agency. I want to recognize the presence of our good friend from Canada here, chairman of the commission there, Conrad von Finkenstein. It was my great pleasure to be in Ottawa about 18 months ago and visit with him there and learn of the many good things our friends and neighbors to the north are undertaking. So thank you all. It's a very distinguished panel, and I'm not going to delay your deliberations further except to highlight the importance of what it is that you're about. The principles that we fought for in the Internet Policy Statement 4 years ago focus squarely on consumer rights. Again, this is a consumer agency. And while just about everybody gains from the availability of an open Internet, nobody gains more than consumers. And I have been advocating long and hard for the Commission to establish a mechanism to ensure that consumers have continued access to a vibrant and open Internet. Much as the Internet has transformed us, we haven't yet really begun to realize, I think, the potential of this technology to remake the world we live in. And the opportunities to throw obstacles into the openness and the vitality of the Internet are legion, as to such things as consolidating content control, or gaming the architecture of the net, or creating an environment where people can not only speak but also be heard. The tremendous challenges are all ahead of us, and they're all central to this theme of transparency that you're going to be talking about today. So without further ado, I will let you get on with that, but we appreciate the expertise and the dedication that you bring here. And I see my colleague, Commissioner Clyburn, here, and would like to welcome her and see if she would like to make a few words of introduction.
Thank you, Commissioner Copps, Mr. Chairman, and all of you incredible guests. It's good to put faces on names that I've been reading about over especially the last several months as I decided to migrate to the north, so to speak. It's no secret that the primary area in which this current commission has sought to improve is transparency. That concept applies to both industries we regulate and to ourselves. With respect to industry, we are in the process of conducting an inquiry into whether or not communications service providers are supplying consumers with the information they require to make informed decisions about the services and plans most beneficial to them. Internally, the way in which we have conducted our efforts toward producing a national broadband plan, holding a record number of public workshops, issuing numerous public notices, and utilizing every conceivable form of social media known to humankind makes clear that we are committed to a transparent FCC. But I am not convinced, however, that consumers and content and application developers have all the information they need. Consider the unexplained fees some wireless service providers include in the consumer's monthly bills. Consider the actual speeds of wireline broadband internet connections appear to be only a fraction of the advertised speeds. And consider at least one known example of undisclosed blocking of consumers' lawful internet traffic by a major cable provider in 2008. We have a long way to go. I am pleased to see major broadband service providers participating in today's workshop. Broadband providers play an essential role in controlling the entry and exit points that consumers and content and application providers depend on to access the internet. I am eager to hear about how these providers see their responsibilities with respect to adequately disclosing their service terms and how their networks are being managed. Transparency is a fairly easy word to say, but I sincerely hope that it does not become a mere buzzword. It is essential that consumers and developers have all the information necessary for them to make informed decisions. I am all for a thriving industry, but not when it occurs on the basis of consumer confusion or misperception. When all the players have fully and clearly disclosed their services, plans, and management of their networks, only then can we have a market that flourishes on the basis of the quality of services provided and American consumers can truly reap the benefits of the industry with perhaps the greatest innovative potential among all. Thank you all for allowing me to share these few thoughts with you this afternoon, and I look forward to working with you to develop a meaningful and robust sixth principle. Thank you very much.
I will be very brief because I am just really grateful for our great panel that have come from so far and thrones beyond to inform us. This is a workshop, so we are here to learn. I want to thank Chairman Janikowski for the terrific processes he's put a transparent process together so that we can talk about transparency. I really do encourage broad participation. I want to also thank Chairman Leibowitz and Chairman von Finkenstein for being here. Your leadership is very important, and we are grateful for your participation. I was privileged last week to actually go to the Innovation and Investment Workshop. It was in Cambridge, so we had a little less familiar crowd, but hello to those online as well. These are really turning out to be very, very helpful to us as we look forward to the careful and thoughtful consideration that we're giving to these rules. There we heard from some industry representatives and some policy experts about the various forces and the considerations that shape the way that internet entrepreneurs and the network operators interact in their usage of the internet today and how they'd like to do it tomorrow. While there was broad agreement from all the parties on the need to keep the internet open, there was certainly a divergence of views on the best way to do it. I think that transparency about internet practices and policies will be an important factor in taking that discussion forward and may be a path to more common ground. To me, transparency and the open internet go hand in hand. The more that is known about the policies and the practices of a particular internet service, the better members of the public at large are served. Whether a casual web user or a hardcore internet, a kid with a cool idea for a single app, or a software developer who makes her living from launching crazy, that was the term from last week, crazy web-based ideas, everyone can benefit from more, better, and clearer information about what happens on a particular internet connection. So again, I want to thank Chairman Janikowski for putting this together. We're going to develop an ample record, even more than we already have. So as we move forward, if we make any decisions, it will be based on a record. I really do think that these issues are critical to the future of the internet. I think it's critical to the successful deployment of broadband to all Americans, and I think it's really critical to our economy. So thanks for being here.
So let me again thank each of my colleagues. I think one of the strands that you hear from all of the comments from all the commissioners are the importance of transparency, the importance of this process to air ideas, to roll up our sleeves, to really understand how we can make sure that this vital medium serves the country well. So thank you, Commissioner Copps, Commissioner Clyburn, Commissioner Baker, for participating. These are the kinds of discussions we have among ourselves as well. And let me thank each of you for saying something about this process. What we're having here today is part of our ongoing experimentation and focus on improving the processes at the FCC, making them more open, having them be transparent, and facilitating a narrowing of the issues and a rolling up of our sleeves to figure out what the real questions are, what the facts and data are, how can we best solve them. We're experimenting with many things here as we do this. This proceeding is open to the internet, and I think as you'll hear from Joel and Julie, there'll be opportunities for people who are participating remotely to ask questions. We encourage just vibrant, open dialogue in these. These are staff-level working sessions at these workshops, and so I thank you all for just saying what you think and helping Joel and Julie and the staff and all of us get our arms around these incredibly vital issues for the country. And so with that, thank you again to my colleagues on the Commission, the staff who put this together, each of the participants, those of you who are here and participating online. Joel, will you take it from here?
Yes, I will.
Terrific.
Okay.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman Janikowski. Thank you, Commissioners. And thank you for laying out so clearly and really so forcefully why we're here today. We are looking at an extremely important issue that I think we all believe can affect the future of the Internet very significantly. And in looking at the open Internet, what we are particularly focused on today is transparency and the sixth principle. So I am going to speak just for a minute or two and then turn it over to Julie, who will talk about our how we're going to go through our process today. I think it's worth, since this is all about the sixth principle, I think it's worth actually reading it aloud for everybody. What we are proposing as the sixth principle is that, quote, subject to reasonable network management, a provider of broadband internet access service must disclose such information concerning network management and other practices as is reasonably required for users and content, application, and service providers to enjoy the protections of these open internet principles. So a few things about that. One is that the sixth principle includes both disclosure of information on network management and other practices. And I think it's almost impossible to talk about network management without talking about other issues like broadband speed, broadband performance, and issues that are related to the consumer experience. But I do want to emphasize that the particular focus of this workshop today really is on network management principles and that whole array of issues that relate to how open the internet is in terms of the consumer experience. We are going forward in discussing the sixth principle with a lot of belief that transparency can be tremendously valuable both for consumers and for ensuring a competitive marketplace. And we will be asking a number of questions today. Some of the kinds of questions that I think we'll get into include what kind of information consumers really need about broadband network management practices and other practices. What kind of information do they have today? What tools do they have or could be used to get at information that is not currently disclosed? How should this information be presented? And how do these issues vary from wireline to wireless broadband service? And finally, what are the appropriate roles of the public and private sectors in defining these disclosure policies? So I do want to thank everybody on this panel. We are very fortunate to have such a remarkable group of speakers today. I look very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say, to having a good discussion. I also want to thank on my right Julie Saunier and Rebecca Herschel, who put a lot of work into developing this workshop as well. And without further ado, Julie, please take it from here.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. We have an exciting lineup for this afternoon. As many of you may know, we also have a technical advisory process that has been working primarily focused on the fifth principle, the non-discrimination. But we've also integrated with all of the other areas of the rulemaking, including the sixth principle, and been working closely with Joel and his team. And sometimes the biggest challenge is taking very technical information and translating it in ways that are meaningful, in this case, not only for consumers and businesses, but for innovators and application developers who really need to not just have the high-level information, but to be able to drill down into the network management practices that the providers have put in place. For this afternoon, we're going to begin with framing remarks from two senior officials from the Ftc and Crtc, and we're very fortunate to have them with us this afternoon, and I'll introduce them momentarily. We'll then have each of our panelists make a very brief presentation and to please try to keep the remarks to about 5 minutes. Then after a short break, we'll have about an hour for discussion, including questions and answers not only from Joel and I, but also from the audience and those who are following online. If you're here in the commission meeting room, write down the questions on note cards that are on a table near the entrance. You'll be able to pick those up at the break, and then give them to the person we'll have at the back of the room collecting them. You can also email questions to newmedia@fcc.gov, or post comments and questions to Twitter, mark it with hashtag number OIDiscuss. On our website, openinternet.gov, you can find the agenda for today's workshop and bios for all of the participants, and you can watch live streaming of the proceedings. With that, I'd like to introduce Chairman John Leibowitz. He has nearly 2 decades of a very distinguished career in public service. Of note, he served in the United States Senate for 14 years in various positions, including 3 years as Democratic Chief Counsel and Staff Director for the Senate Antitrust Subcommittee, and 1 year as the Chief Counsel and Staff Director for the Senate Subcommittee on Terrorism and Technology. In September of 2004, he began serving as the at the Federal Trade Commission as one of its commissioners, and he became chairman in March of 2009. It's my great honor to introduce Chairman Leibowitz. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Let me just ask a quick question. Do you want me to sit at the table, or should I go up? I'm neutral as to venue, or platform, but As long as it's transparent to everyone.
I think we've got you covered either way with the cameras, so just if you're comfortable there, that's fine.
I'll stay here. Well, thank you so much for that kind and undeserved introduction, and I just want to also thank Chairman Janikowski and Commissioner Baker, Commissioner Copps, and Commissioner Clymer, Commissioner McDowell, who I don't see here, but I know is peripatetically in and around, for having this workshop and for inviting me to speak. I was thinking and I don't consider myself to be a Washington institution, despite what Julia said about me, and I will be remembering that when we play basketball together next Sunday. But I will say that as I look around, this is really one of the strongest commissions I have seen in my not quite lifetime in Washington, and it's also great to see the transparency here at the commission, which had been questioned, as I think we all know, in the past. So we are following your work at the Commission with enormous interest, and very impressed with the energy and the vision that the Commission, and that really you, the staff working to come up with ways to implement that vision, are bringing to a notoriously, I would say, difficult and vexing issue. It seems that you really have begun to cut through the sort of dystopian futures envisioned by each side of the net neutrality debate if the other side's policy prescriptions are adopted. And there's no doubt in my mind that you're headed towards a reasonable, thoughtful, pro-consumer middle ground with your rule. As everybody recognizes, transparency and an open internet are critical components of future broadband services to consumers and of further innovation in this incredibly dynamic and innovative industry. And that's especially true, I think, on the content side. But it's also clear to me that absent some efforts by the FCC, those principles are not going to be certainties in the internet of tomorrow. Will carriers slow down or interfere with applications or services? Will some sorts of services be prioritized over others? If so, will consumers be told about any of this before they sign up? And if they are told, will it be told in a way that they can understand it without having, say, a PhD in electrical engineering? And at a time when they can make a choice whether or not to accept the terms. Will they be told if the terms of service change? These are all important issues for consumers as they buy internet access, and indeed they're sort of at the heart of what the FTC sees in a variety of other industries on an everyday basis. These questions implicate some of our core concerns, whether consumers are told what they're paying for, and whether, so that they can make informed decisions, of course, and whether there's competition in the marketplace. Let me start with the consumer protection component, which really boils down to what will people know and when will they know it. So I suppose it always really boils down to what Howard Baker said in the Watergate hearings. Okay. That wasn't a really good joke, but it was an attempt at humor. I am happy to see that the FCC has proposed to add a new principle of transparency to its 4 internet freedoms. With adequate transparency and disclosure, consumers are able to choose winners and losers in the marketplace. They can pick the technology, services, and companies that best fit their needs at the prices that they're willing to pay. Providers that offer the best deals can grow and serve even more consumers. And this is true in any market, but I think it's especially true in a market like broadband, where consumers may not know what services they're buying when they buy it without adequate disclosures. At the FTC, we've been working on issues that involve transparency and disclosure to consumers for many years. And these technologies themselves are very familiar to us. For example, in 2007, we investigated claims by Sprint Nextel that it was offering unlimited mobile web access to its subscribers when, in fact, it was actually selling services that were limited by a monthly ceiling. Now, we ended up closing that investigation because the claims appeared not to be part of a broad marketing plan to mislead consumers, and Sprint acted quickly. I think it was a Nextel plan, and they acquired this plan, and then they acted quickly to remove the deceptive claims and to voluntarily make refunds to subscribers who may have been harmed by its failure to disclose the broadband access ceilings. But as staff noted in its letter to Sprint indicating that it was closing its investigation, we, and I quote, take very seriously the sorts of claims investigated here and will continue to monitor such claims made by Sprint as well as those made by the rest of industry. And transparency is important for another reason. unless the FCC knows what ISPs are doing to manage their networks, how can you make the necessary distinctions between reasonable network management that allows ISPs to provide better services to their customers and the potentially abusive behavior that might harm consumers? I'm not saying anyone engages in in abusive behavior, but I'm saying to make that rulemaking as robust and as informed as possible, it's important that you understand what carriers are doing or what companies are doing. Disclosure of network management techniques and plans by the providers is vital if we're to understand what industry best practices are. And it seems to me that ISPs should be talking about what they believe are reasonable network management practices and what they believe are not, if they want a rule that benefits them and the American consumer. Let me be clear. I welcome the FCC's involvement in this area, and clearly from the opening statements of all the commissioners, you recognize that the principle of transparency and disclosure is enormously important. If you move forward with this rulemaking, and particularly with this provision, we're going to continue our close working relationship and leverage the expertise of both agencies. The other principle that the FCC has proposed to add is non-discrimination. Broadband providers must, and I quote, treat lawful content, applications, and services in a non-discriminatory manner, subject to reasonable network management, end quote. From my perspective, some form of anti-discrimination language is critical to ensuring an open internet, and reasonable network management is also critical to allow ISPs to serve their customers better by, for example, managing network capacity, stopping spam and spyware, something that our agency has an enormous amount of familiarity about. Non-discrimination is a somewhat controversial proposal, and one that the FTC staff wrote extensively about in the wake of our broadband competition workshop in 2007. In the report that we wrote on broadband competition, staff reviewed the record created by the two-day workshop and the evidence that existed at the time on the state of broadband competition and the provision of broadband services. The FTC staff made what I believed in 2007 and still believe today to be a very useful contribution to the debate. Indeed, the Commission voted unanimously to issue the report. But let me just caution those who refer to the report in the current debate to do so carefully. In particular, it should be clear from reading the report itself that while staff advised, quote, proceeding with caution before enacting broad ex-ante restrictions in an unsettled dynamic environment, end quote, they also recognized that a failure to act could be problematic. Further, and I think all of us know this, when you're doing evidence-based public policy work, it comes with an expiration date. And it reflects the possibility that things can change after the work is finished. To some extent, that applies to the FTC staff's 2007 broadband report. It has been nearly 3 years since that report was issued, which, as we all know, is an eternity in Internet time. Just as an example, the report was completed before the Comcast BitTorrent controversy that I suspect will be, in fact, looking at the panel, I know will be a topic of discussion today. And as a result, it didn't really focus on the question of reasonable network management as a component to a balanced net neutrality regime. Taken together, experience suggests a reason to question now, I think, what was a reasonable concern then about potentially premature and unnecessary regulation. One of the critical predicates of staff's caution regarding rules of the road for the Internet in 2007 was the presence or the possible development of competition in broadband markets. As staff noted, competition provides the best results for consumers, providing the lowest prices, the highest quality products, services, and the most choices. At that time, staff working on the report focused on disagreements over whether there was competition in the industry. It's a stretch, but you could have read the FCC statistics available at the time when the report was written to indicate that consumers in many zip codes had access to a very large number of broadband Internet access providers. But I would say it seems clear now that a better reading of those statistics and a better analysis of today's marketplace is that broadband internet access is at best essentially a duopoly in many markets. Now, that's not to say there isn't price competition, because I think there is a lot of price competition, at least right now, while competitors are trying to sign up subscribers. But nearly all consumers buy their broadband internet access from either their cable provider or their local phone company. And more importantly, in the report, FCC staff also foresaw, and I have to say we were all hoping for, potential entry from a number of new actors who hadn't provided broadband access to consumers in any volume before. Among those were Wi-Fi, WiMAX, other broadband technologies. And what we've seen since then, however, is that the hope for competition has largely not materialized. Most critically, what seemed at that time to be a burgeoning movement of municipally sponsored broadband has never occurred. And by the way, the first report we wrote before we wrote our broadband competition report was a report that raised questions about those companies that were going around from state to state trying to restrict pass state laws that would prohibit cities from offering broadband. The fact that municipal broadband hasn't been terribly effective, or hasn't been the competitor that people think, is a good reminder that you really ought to let the marketplace work, rather than trying to, even if you have the capacity to, sort of ratchet back anti-competitive or implement anti-competitive rules. The WiMAX rollout also appears to have gone far more slowly than anticipated, and I don't think I need to say much about broadband over power lines. Probably the less said, the better. On the other hand, mobile broadband, spearheaded by the iPhone and Google's Android, has grown faster, and it may become a game changer someday, but I think we all agree that day hasn't quite arrived yet. So I would also say this: to the extent that the report was also skeptical about the need for rules, given the ability of antitrust enforcement to ensure competition in these markets, it appeared to me, even at that time, that staff was overly confident about the ability of antitrust law to deal with net neutrality-based concerns. And since we released the report, my colleague Commissioner Rush has also looked at these issues and has come to similar conclusions. To be sure, antitrust is a useful vehicle for thinking about these issues, and the FTC has a unique and broad enforcement authority under Section 5 of the FTC Act to stop unfair methods of competition, but it is reasonable for and appropriate for the FCC to consider the possibility that such enforcement may take too long and not do much good in many cases. And so I guess I started to read, and I have not finished reading, the Google Verizon submission today. And to the extent that it suggests that the FCC shouldn't be doing a rulemaking, which arguably it does in, I think, paragraph 6, I do take some issue with that. I think this rulemaking is critical. I don't take any issue with the notion of the FTC staying involved in these areas, of course. The FTC report recommended a cautious and thorough approach to any net neutrality regulations, and that's the right approach to take. But to my mind, the FCC's initiative, as demonstrated by this workshop, your thoughtful NPR that began the process last year, does this job admirably. The rules that come out of this process have the potential really to benefit everyone, not just consumers who need to understand what services they will receive, but also the businesses that provide these services. And the need for predictability for these firms is critical given the long-term investments made by many in the industry, including ISPs. It seems to me that the current proposal does a better job of addressing those concerns ex ante than an ad hoc approach that leaves many uncertain about what they can and what they can't do. And clear rules of the road, by the way, are a much better defense against a public outcry over a questionable practice in an unregulated environment that'll sometimes force companies, including companies in this space, to backtrack on important investment decisions long after those decisions have been made. As David Cohen from Comcast recently noted, we are all obviously better off having clear rules. I will follow that admonition with another clear rule, which is that it's better to stop speaking before people are really tired of hearing you talk. And let me now introduce this terrific and interesting panel on transparency in the open internet. Julie, do you want to do that, or should I do that? It's in my talking points, but I have a feeling that maybe you're prepared to do that too.
Yeah, I think
I think I'll stop right here, and you can turn it over to my colleague from our good neighbor to the north.
Thank you very much. Look forward to continuing to working with the FTC very closely. The Honorable Conrad von Finkenstein has dedicated his 37-year career to public service, and I can only highlight a few of his notable achievements. He served as chairman of competition and the head of the Competition Bureau of Canada for 6 years, from 1997 to 2003. He also led the drive to establish the International Competition Network and became its founding chairman until being appointed as a justice of the federal court. Mr. von Finkenstein served as a justice until 3 years ago when he was appointed to chair the CRTC. We're very pleased that he has joined us today and look forward to his sharing his experiences on dealing with similar issues up in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I've never participated at an FCC workshop, but I've read many results of them, and I think it's a wonderful innovation which we should probably copy in Canada. I wanted to share with you today our views on network management. We struggle with the same issues, and we've had recently made a major decision on it, which I wanted to explain to you. The CRTC gets its mandate from the Canadian Broadcasting Act and Telecommunications Act. Internet service providers are subject to the Telecommunications Act. And aside from mandating access to wholesale customers, something which you don't do, we look at fair and reasonable terms of conditions, we monitor the activities, and we act on complaints about their business practices. Obviously, with consumers and broadband connection becoming increasingly a part of our society and being essential for commerce, health, education, entertainment, governments, these issues are coming very much to the front. And the demand on the network capacity is rising with many new applications, especially such things as real-time video, streaming, gaming, HD video, or maybe 3D. We actually had an actual case which pointed out to us the need for some rules in this role, and so we dealt with that case on its terms, but we then held a major policy hearing on what you call network neutrality, which we call internet traffic management, but it's all the same. And basically the question obviously that comes up, to what extent should internet providers, service providers be permitted to control or influence the user's web experience? To what extent can they protect the legitimate interests regarding the integrity of the networks without impinging on the use and the enjoyment of the internet by its users? We held a public hearing basically covering the 6 points that the FTC has announced. And we had numerous written submissions, we had online consultations, we had got more than 14,000 online comments, and we had a 6-day public hearing. In October 2009, we then announced our decision, and that's what I want to share with you too now. As background, I showed when we started the proceedings and when all internet service providers participated, it became clear that some are using ITMPs right now, some are using only on specific times, and some are not using them at all. And certainly the public had no idea who was doing what. For approach purposes, we found out the best way to do it is to, in effect, talk of two separate practices: economic practices and technical practices. Economic practices obviously are those where they charge consumers depending on their use and how much bandwidth they use. Technical measures are such things where you use tools such as deep packet inspection to manage the traffic of networks by slowing down or prioritizing certain types of web traffic or limiting heavy users. Our approach applies both to retail and wholesale, but I'll only talk with the retail because we don't have a mandated wholesale. As a result of the hearing, we firmly reaffirmed our often stated view that the first response of any ISPs to bandwidth demand should be to make investment and increase its capacity whenever possible. Secondly, we said that you may employ internet traffic management without our prior approval as long as they are consistent with the framework which we established, which I will outline in a moment. Thirdly, we said you should always prefer economic ITMPs over technical one, because they are obviously transparent, they're inherent in the equity, and people eat what they pay for. And certainly then, if you use economic ITMPs, they have to be in a manner consistent with our Telecommunications Act, which has basically two principles: no unjust discrimination and no unreasonable preferences. We will look at these matters ex post facto if there is a complaint and see whether they have done it properly. And the frameworks that we will use to evaluate are based on, as I say, these two concepts of unjust discrimination and undue preference. Our Act states, no Canadian carrier shall, in relation to the provision of a telecommunication service or the charging of a rate for it, unjustly discriminate or give undue or unreasonable preference toward any person, including itself, or subject any person to an undue or unreasonable disadvantage. Our framework works as follows. If we receive a complaint from a retail or wholesale customer about an internet traffic management, we will use the following criteria. First of all, is it the ITMP in question, is it designed to address a specific purpose and nothing else? Secondly, is it as narrowly tailored as possible to achieve desired result using the least restrictive means? Thirdly, it causes as little harm as possible to the retail customer, application provider, or the ISP, that's the wholesale customer. Fourthly, network investments or economic approaches would not effectively deal with the same issue or achieve the same purpose. And lastly, it is well advertised in advance. Now, there's one exception to this rule, which is of ex post facto review, which is if you do anything to block the delivery of content, or you slow it down to such a time that it becomes incoherent, and the content is degraded, then you have to come and get prior approval from us. Those would be the most truly exceptional circumstances, and I frankly can't envision that we would ever give it. But if the ISP feels for traffic management purposes they have to affect content, or they have to degrade it to such a time that it is no longer comprehensible, they have to come for prior approval. Now, what then about the issue of transparency that this hearing is about? Transparency is one of our four key principles. At the CRTC, we have four key principles. There's fairness, our decision has to be fair. Diligence, they have to be as quickly as possible because time is money. They have to be transparent so people understand it, and they have to be predictable so that everybody knows the rules of the role. And since we apply it to ourselves, we obviously expect it from the people whom we regulate as well. And as it was stunning that most of the consumer groups came before us were not even aware of the fact that they are ITMPs and they are being applied. There was no information on anybody's website. It was not disclosed in the billing practices or in the contracts that ISPs signed with their customers, not even in the fine print. We decided to establish the following rules. First of all, if you're going to use an ITMP, you must inform your users 30 days in advance before you can apply it. And this motivation must be in plain language, displayed prominently on your website, and has to describe precisely in an intelligible form so that an average consumer could understand. Number one, why is this ITMP introduced? Two, who will be affected by it? When will it occur? During what hours, etc.? What type of traffic is subject to this internet practice? Is it limited to a specific application or specific type, or is it to every user? And lastly, how will it affect the user's internet experience, including the specific impact on speeds? This is vital information so that the consumer can make an informed judgment and can decide whether he wants to vote with his feet and go to another provider or stay with this provider. Of course, you're fully conscious that people don't buy ISP services alone. They usually buy it in bundles, and that information may not be sufficient, but at least the consumer will know and will have the choice whether he wants to break out of the bundle or go to somebody else and buy a new bundle or whatever. We also dealt with the privacy because part of our mandate is privacy, and we found that any data that you collect or that you create for the purposes of administering an ITMP can be used for that purpose only and no other purpose. It can also obviously not be resold or used for marketing or any. So ITMP information has to be, as soon as you don't need it anymore, you destroy it, and you only use it for that purpose. Now, the mobile wireless, which Chairman Leibowitz mentioned, is becoming more important. In Canada right now, until the data side is exempted from our regulation. We did that about 10 years ago, when it was far less important, obviously, than today. And we firmly stated that we expect the mobile providers to act on the same principles as the ISPs. If not, we will revoke the exemption either partially or totally in order to give them exactly the same treatment as we have given the wireline ones. So, in conclusion, our framework is intended to foster an environment where ISPs, application providers, and users have the utmost freedom to innovate. At the same time, we have to respect the legitimate interest of ISPs to manage their networks. It was a balancing act, and first results would seem to indicate we have hit the right balance. This is the only decision that I've ever taken where everybody who participated has been laudatory at the end. Whether it was users, consumers, technology companies, ISPs, any other group, everybody said, well, more or less you got it right. The decision came into effect 30 days after we made it, i.e. in November, and is now we are carefully watching the websites of the ISP providers, whether they have lived up to it. But it would seem they have. But as always, we basically are complaints-driven. We wait for consumers to come forward and say, here's a problem, etc. And if there is, we will investigate it, and we will apply the framework that I outlined to you. So much for the Canadian experience. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to your discussion.
Thank you. I'm struck by the fact that we have so many stars and so little time. I hope you'll forgive me. We've got the full bios for each of our speakers up on the website. I can assure you that they are incredibly impressive and are experts in all of the topics that they're going to talk about. So without further ado, I'll just introduce the speaker, and we'll try to keep it to 5 minutes and move it through, and so that we can get on to the second part of the session with the questions and answers. Sasha Meinrath, you'll go first, surprise. Keep them all on their toes. He's the director of New America Foundation's Open Technology Initiative. He has other titles as well. Sasha, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Well, I wanted to begin by thanking the Commission for granting me this opportunity to discuss transparency and data collection and the efforts that I and many others have done over both the last few months and years, but also dating back many years and decades beyond that. The Open Technology Initiative is a think tank within a think tank. We formulate policy and regulatory reforms that promote affordable, universal, ubiquitous communication systems. As you can probably gather by its name, you know my biases on this. And we provide also in-depth, objective research, analysis, and findings for policymakers and the general public. And the nuts and bolts of what I'm going to talk about today are actually covered in depth in our December 14th, 2009 comments on Public Notice number 24. And in that 115-page filing, you'll find extensive technological documentation on both real-world options of our data collection efforts, as well as context from the research literature on what's been done previously and how problems that have been raised by some commentators and probably some of our panelists have already been addressed. Now, as we begin the second decade of the 21st century, I'm utterly astounded by the level of ignorance presented to the FCC when it comes to the history of data reporting on the Internet. And I say this because first and foremost, the Internet was and continues to be a research endeavor. And as a research initiative, data collection and transparency have been at the heart of this endeavor since its very inception. So many of the statements made about the issue being too complex or technologically infeasible simply do not hold water, and many of the solutions have been around for years, if not decades. So let me be clear. Almost all of the useful information that we would like to see made publicly available is already being collected by system administrators and ISPs. And for the research and scientific community, the problem isn't how to collect information that would be useful to consumers and to policymakers. The question is really, how is it that the successful public data collection practices stopped in the first place? And to drive this home, I found a memo from January 9th, 1995, exactly 15 years ago this month, from Merit, which ran NSFNet. And I'll quote very briefly from this memo. This was right at the time that the NSFNet was privatized, and they said, quote, NSFNet performance statistics have been collected, processed, stored, and reported by the Merit network since 1988. During December 1994, the numbers contained in Merit's statistical reports began to decrease as NSFNet traffic began to migrate to the new NSF network architecture, i.e. was privatized. Once the new architecture is in place, Merit will be unable to collect the data needed to continue these traffic-based reports. The reports will be discontinued by spring 1995. Since then, as we have seen, year after year after year, there's been a steady removal of useful information from the public domain. The data collection requirements mandated under NSFNet gave way to voluntary adherence to these norms, and the data collection and transparency that had happened was eliminated with disastrous consequences. So when the story is written about how the United States went from number 1 in broadband service provision to our current appalling international standing, it's clear that willful ignorance has led to a series of unbelievably short-sighted policy actions and inactions. And this loss of useful broadband information has systematically disempowered users of the internet and allowed for the creation of increasingly dysfunctional markets. However, all is not doom and gloom. The FCC has both an opportunity and the responsibility to rectify these problems. And I'll focus the remainder of my time on two simple solutions to the problems that I've laid out. The first is OTI's Truth in Broadband Advertising proposal, which has gained a wee bit of traction since we first proposed it. And the second is the MeasurementLab.net initiative. Now, when we proposed a broadband nutrition label, as some have called it, we were drawing both from the notion that consumers want meaningful information and that they have an increasingly diverse array of needs for their broadband connections. Our Truth in Broadband Advertising proposal would ensure that specific information is made available to consumers, for example, upload-download speeds, uptime, latency, and pricing, and that private industry had the opportunity to decide what levels of service they would guarantee to their customers. In fact, this practice is already being done today on most business class lines. They contain levels of service agreements, they contain guarantees of available uptimes, and they enable businesses to make informed decisions about and contrast amongst multiple service offerings. The FCC has the ability to implement these disclosures immediately, but is under substantial pressure to avoid meaningful information for consumers and adopt a 5-star rating that could utterly gut the intent of OTI's proposals. Consumers want meaningful information, and the FCC has a responsibility to create clear disclosure rules that ensure customers have access to this fundamental information about their broadband service offerings in both the wireline and wireless world. A 5-star rating could be an information gateway, but only if the FCC also includes a clear mandate that the useful information underpinning this rating system is also disclosed and easily accessible to consumers. Of course, in order for consumers to be able to test their broadband connections and know about them, they first must have the tools to collect this information. The FCC should lead an extensive effort to measure and collect fundamental data on their broadband service capabilities and internet performances, traffic statistics, etc., across the country. This effort should contain both nationally comparative information as well as a level of granularity that allows customers to compare offerings within their own neighborhood, amongst their friends, and across different internet service providers. Now, within this context, the Open Technology Initiative has led a global coalition of researchers from Planet Lab and other institutes, along with a number of corporate partners, to pioneer a unique broadband measurement platform, the MeasurementLab.net project. And the MeasurementLab.net initiative, or MLab for short, is itself an open distributed server platform for researchers to deploy internet measurement tools. And our goal is really to advance both network research on the one hand, as well as to empower the public with useful information about their broadband connections, as well as, and to give policymakers the information they need to make informed decisions. So every broadband measurement tool on MLab is entirely open source, which means that if you have concerns about the objectivity of the tests, we'll give you the code, and please look through it and tell us where there's a problem. MLab is open to participation from all quarters, which means that if you want to be involved, if you have a measurement tool that you would like to put onto this platform, you can do so, and you should contact us immediately. And all data collected by Measurement Lab is made publicly available under a Creative Commons 0 license. So anyone who wants to crunch these numbers or use them for any purpose whatsoever may do so. At its heart, MLab is an open, independent, and transparent process for developing a suite of internet measurement tools, for collecting data in an objective manner, and for ensuring that this useful information is made publicly available in a timely manner. So the FCC has the opportunity to leverage these assets and create tools and information resources needed to empower consumers. So here's my take-home messages. First, systematic data collection efforts and the public release of these data have been a part of the internet since its inception and only ceased in the mid-1990s when NSFNet was privatized. Second, the best metrics for the data and the needs that we have for collecting this data and the processes for collecting this information have already been identified in a prototype system set up and fully operational. And third, that the technological and scientific underpinnings have already been established, and thus this really boils down to an issue of a need for clear leadership from the FCC. So with forthright leadership, 2010 should be the year that consumers are finally empowered with meaningful broadband information, and the FCC started turning around broadband in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. Our next speaker will be Jay Monahan. He is Vice President and General Counsel of Views.
Thank you.
Jay?
Thank you. I'm honored and pleased to be a part of this debate, to have been a part of this debate for a couple of years now. And we originally became involved because we actually are a real company. We're that company that I think they talk about when they talk about innovation and investment. We are an online video platform that has raised $30 million in venture capital funding from Sand Hill Road in Silicon Valley to create and distribute a platform for delivering content. Also, some might consider competition for the established players. About 3 years ago, we, like many of you, were reading probably online or your hard copy newspaper and saw an article about a guy named Rob Topolsky that discovered what he thought was something strange going on with his internet connection. As you all know, at this point, he went to AP Wire Services. They replicated some tests that he had done, and that led to what we now know as the interference with the BitTorrent traffic by Comcast. Now, when that story broke, somebody in my office, which, as we pointed out at the Harvard hearing, our 20-person company above the Chinese restaurant in Palo Alto, we're actually now above a bank, just for the record. Somebody in the office said, well, hey, aren't they talking about us? And in fact, that is exactly what was going on, because our product, our content, which is licensed content at that time from many studios, was being delivered using the very technology that was addressed by Comcast's particular techniques used at that time, which the Commission has since condemned. Later in this debate, we heard that another carrier at least announced that it was beginning some tests to prioritize traffic. And according to its public announcements and its website, it was going to classify certain traffic as time sensitive and certain traffic as non-time sensitive. Well, the non-time sensitive traffic included all peer-to-peer traffic. The problem, of course, is that the technology that we use to deliver our licensed content is technically peer-to-peer traffic, and it was all classified by them as non-time sensitive. Now, the problem at the time, just to drill down a little bit so you get sort of the sense of how the rubber really hits the road, is that we had two features at the time. One was what we called progressive downloads, which was a streaming-like experience where you literally hit a play button and then with a few seconds delay it would play. And of course the delay we were working on getting shorter and shorter and shorter, so it was essentially equivalent to what you think of streaming when you hit a video on YouTube. We also were working on something called peer-assisted streaming, which also worked for HD content. Peer-assisted streaming works such that we could obtain the content from multiple sources, and eventually some of the sources that would be used to deliver the content would come from peers who had already downloaded whatever the video was. So in both cases, these were certainly products that we considered to be extremely time sensitive. And when we read that article, somebody in the office said, "Hey, isn't that us they're talking about?" And that is exactly what's going on here. What I want to bring to this discussion, obviously the consumer disclosure is critically important, particularly for consumers who want to know whether a particular feature that we offer will actually work. But when you are the competitor, when you're getting millions of other people's money to build a product, to run a product, to expand a product, we're not, from a business point of view, it's difficult to rely on having the next Rob Topolsky out there who's going to discover something that may be going on behind the scenes. The particular technique, of course, that Comcast used was condemned by the Commission. There may be other techniques that may be perfectly permissible, but as a person helping to run a company and as investors, we still want to know exactly what those things are, because it may mean that a particular service is not feasible or it's not reliable. Another reason for disclosure, which you appreciate when you are sort of hearing from the consumer directly, is that when there is an interference with the delivery of a product, like a streaming product, we know that consumers are very sensitive to the amount of time that it takes for pages to load, the amount of time it takes when you hit the play button. And when there is something going on potentially behind the scenes that interferes with the delivery of the product, of course the consumer says it must be us, meaning it must be the company's product, and it doesn't necessarily occur to them that it's actually somebody in a back room forging packets on particular types of traffic. So I think it certainly makes sense from our point of view, in order to deal with our own consumers. We're certainly willing to take responsibility for the defects of our product or the infirmities of our own product. We should not have to take responsibility for interference that may be coming from other parties. Were there adequate disclosure, we certainly would be able to note that certain performance issues have to do with your ISP and not with us. Obviously, those folks are going to be able to make their own decisions as to which ISP to use. Now, that said, as has been aptly pointed out, and I'm sure will come up further in this panel, we don't think that you can approach transparency issues without considering the fact that there is so little competition now in consumer choice. To that end, disclosure by itself is not sufficient unless you also have the network management rules that go with it to identify which practices are permissible and which are not permissible. I wanted to also note that we appreciate that there are certain types of practices that go on that relate to security. There are certain types that go on that relate to emergency tactics that need to be taken by carriers. There probably will be less disclosure available in those cases. We understand that, but we believe that for the everyday practices about upload speeds and download speeds, or I probably should say continuous upload speed and continuous download speeds, not just peak speeds, and any tactics or any techniques that are used that would slow down traffic or block traffic or delay traffic ought to be disclosed. One other note that I think was a point that was alluded to earlier, that this debate sort of originally there was a bit of a semantical debate about blocking versus slowing. And I think as a technical matter, what happened with the torrent traffic with Comcast was in fact blocking. But when you are offering a consumer device, it is equally important, in some ways more important, for us to know and for the consumer to know that traffic is being slowed as opposed to blocked, because when traffic is slowed, even if it's still working, if your competitive alternative is working at full speed and you keep experiencing delay, and just think about your own experience when you've tried to load a page and the page sits there and hangs. If it keeps doing that, you're going to say, well, there must be something wrong with the website. We have the same
Jay,
problem.
could you just sum up?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay. So as we go forward in this proceeding, I urge the Commission to strongly factor in the point of view of the Sandhill Roads and the other investment corridors of the world, that we need reliability and we need disclosure at a pretty deep level in order to make investment decisions.
Thanks, Jay.
Thanks. Sorry.
It's always tough moving the clock along because I know there's a lot of interesting information there. We probably can go on for quite a while. Next, I'd like to introduce Parul Desai, who's Vice President of the Media Access Project. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Is this on? Thanks for the opportunity to speak today regarding transparency and disclosure. For over 35 years now, Media Access Project has promoted the values of the First Amendment by working to ensure that all people have access to an open and diverse media, which now includes the internet, and that protects the free flow of information and promotes universal and equitable access to media outlets and telecommunication services. The Supreme Court in Reno versus ACLU has observed that the content of the internet is as diverse as human thought. The internet is an open and interactive medium facilitating communication by anyone to and from everyone, and is a medium that supports and enhances the free expression of citizens and serves as a vehicle for democratic governance and economic activities. One element that is necessary in ensuring that users are able to fully engage in these types of economic, social, and political activities on the internet is making available relevant information regarding the internet access services that consumers purchase. Transparency involves more than just passive consumer interests. Transparency in providing an interactive service affects the public's rights as participants in the marketplace of ideas. So the interests here are also citizens' rights and not just consumer interests. Disclosure of management practices that a provider utilizes is necessary since it allows all users to know what to expect from the internet experience. Full and meaningful disclosure of network management practices and an explanation of how those management tools actually work would benefit both consumers and innovators and both passive and active users. Disclosure would allow internet users to know whether the services and applications they desire will work or be allowed on the network, and would also allow innovators to determine whether their applications or services will work on the network. Disclosure is also necessary to determine whether a particular management practice falls within any rule adopted by the Commission. The only way to determine whether a management practice goes beyond the goals adopted by the Commission is through active, clear, and conspicuous disclosure. Finally, transparency rules are also critical because voluntary commitments are not as effective and sufficient as codified rules. Without actual disclosure requirements, service providers can choose whether or not to disclose certain information or hide the information they do disclose by making it hard to find or disclosing it in fine print. Moreover, strong and effective disclosure requirements minimize the need for other, more burdensome regulations and makes it less likely that the Commission will have to deal with contentious complaint processes as occurred in the undisclosed Comcast BitTorrent situation. So, internet access providers should disclose all practices that they engage in to manage congestions on their networks and practices they use to monitor, manage, or interfere with a user's internet traffic. Such disclosure must be clear and easily accessible. The information should be prominently, plainly, and clearly displayed on a provider's website. I would also ask the Commission to urge ISPs to provide disclosure in various different languages so that all internet users have the ability to access and understand the information provided to them. Prominent, plain, and clear language is especially necessary since many consumers may not read the disclosure terms if it contains legal jargon, small text size, or hidden or hard-to-find placement. The Commission should not expect consumers to take the time to read language in terms that they cannot understand or cannot find. On the other hand, clear and conspicuous disclosure can empower Internet users to make informed decisions regarding the purchase and use of a service. The Commission has sought comment with respect to what disclosure requirements would be useful to Internet users and disclosure requirements that would be useful to content application and service providers. It is important to note, however, that in some cases, Internet users may also one day become innovators, so this distinction is not always clear-cut. Thus, the Commission should establish disclosure requirements that empower all users, regardless of whether they are active or passive users, to make informed decisions about their service. I think the model that the CRTC has is a good model for the Commission to look to in adopting actual requirements. I won't go into what has already been discussed. But overall, I'd like to say that the current NPRM, I think, is a very good start to disclosure requirements, but it will be necessary to clarify and broaden the current language of the NPRM. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to working with the Commission on this issue.
Okay, thank you, Pearl. Our next speaker will be Ron Dicklin. He's the co-founder and chief technology officer of Root Wireless, and I think we've got the presentation up on the screen. And we're set to go, I guess.
Good afternoon, and thank you. Root Wireless is a venture-backed company located out of Seattle, Washington. We specialize in helping consumers make educated, well-informed decisions on their wireless purchases. Though we are a new company, we have over 80 years combined experience supporting emerging technologies with a heavy emphasis in the wireless area. It's no secret that consumers can be overwhelmed when it comes to buying technology, like broadband internet, for example. They need information to help support their buying decisions. They need to make sure that the product first fits their needs. They also need to make certain that the product conforms as advertised in the marketing. They also need to make sure that they're striving for the best value. But buying technology can have some very inherent challenges for both consumers as well as the suppliers of the technology. First, it can be difficult in a fast and effective way to verify that the product meets a particular consumer's needs. There are just some things that cannot be tested in a store or under normal purchasing environment. Second, it's very common to have different expectations on how a product is supposed to perform. Usually, the more cutting edge or newer the technology, the bigger gap in the expectations. Unfortunately, a lot of today's frustration over wireless broadband can be attributed to this type of mismatched expectations. And third, the vast majority of consumers do not want to know the deep technical details to properly support their buying decisions. This requires an effort that the general consumer usually will not invest the time in understanding. They want unbiased information to tell them which product best supports their needs. So with that said, anyone who spent time supporting broadband internet will confirm that these exact same needs and challenges resonate loud and clear for the suppliers and consumers that make up this marketplace. As it relates to wireless broadband specifically, Root Wireless is in the presence of building a business and helping consumers make informed, unbiased decisions regarding their individual wireless data needs. Our backgrounds have enabled us to understand the challenges that face this ecosystem and are investing our knowledge to develop tools that better align wireless data needs with consumers. Our hope, if this is done correctly, it will create a win-win for everyone involved. Given our experience over the last several years, deeply and focused on this issue, we've learned a couple lessons while developing our tools. First, the message needs to be simple. You need to understand the audience. There is no one consumer out there. There are some consumers that don't want to know the technical details, and there are some consumers that want to get very deeply involved in how all this stuff goes together. Second, you need to provide unbiased information. If a consumer thinks that there's somebody trying to get the upper hand, they're not going to pay any attention to the material you're posting. And third, best use known rating methods. Consumers are used to understanding how certain products get rated. I think it was mentioned before here, having some type of a star rating that consumers know, hey, 4 out of 5 stars is a pretty good service. Secondly, and I think most importantly, is setting standards. This makes a scalable solution as wireless data will continue to be very dynamic over the next 5 to 10 years, and we need these standards. Without proper definition on what is being offered, there will be a continuing mismatching of expectations. So by setting standards, it helps better define the product. It helps enhances cross-comparison of like technologies and establishes a common and simplified message. And lastly, moving forward, I think this all relates well to today's topic of discussions, open dialogue around standards and better product definitions. Also being able to use ways of technology to help manage some of these expectations, and I think some of these other panelists will start talking about that. And we truly believe that this is done correctly, everybody will win. Consumers will have a better understanding of the products and services that they are buying, as well as the suppliers of this technology will better align their customers with the products that they are delivering. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to speak here today.
Thank you, Ron. We'll next hear from Gerald Faulhaber, who's currently Professor Emeritus of Business and Public Policy at the Wharton School and a professor at the Penn Law School.
I think currently Professor Emeritus means I'm still alive. That's pretty good. Formerly Chief Economist here, and I will say this visit has been kind of exciting to see a newly energized FCC since the new administration came in. So let me talk a little bit. Where am I here? Oh, okay. We got a little ahead of ourselves, didn't we? Okay. This must be a Macintosh. Okay. What's going on here? We have some technical difficulties here. Ah, good. Okay. Excellent. Okay, where does this fit in? As was mentioned before, there's a number of proceedings, the National Broadband Plan, Open Internet, and where does transparency fit? Now, I want to back up for a minute. I think I'm going to sort of reprise the chairman's views about this. For me, the focus has to be, and this is where transparency fits in, has got to be on what I call consumer-centric markets. And there are three features of consumer-centric markets which are all critical and all important. The first, of course, is competition. Lots of guys slugging it out for the customer's custom. The second is transparency, which is to say, it's no good having a lot of players if you don't know what they're offering. So we have to have disclosure and transparency to make competition work. And lastly, too bad the FTC guy left, which is what I call judicious antitrust. Antitrust which enforces the competitiveness of the market, protects competition, but not competitors. Now, what's the role of regulation in all this? It's basically to enable all of the above. First of all, and this is a whole talk we could give, which is to say encouraging for competition, encouraging wireless broadband through the simple mechanism of getting lots more spectrum out there. The technology is poised to take advantage of that, and I believe can bring competition to the broadband market in a finite time frame. Last, the second step to this is to ensure that all internet firms, and I want to emphasize all internet firms, okay, are transparent for customers. Now, the result is that once you do this, once you achieve this nirvana, okay, customers are in charge. They are now driving decisions. And the people who aren't driving decisions are firms. They have to respond to customers. And it certainly shouldn't be regulators, and it shouldn't be pundits, by which I mean everybody at this table, okay? This is what we mean by customer-centric, okay? Now, successful competition requires transparency. And being an economist, of course, you know, competition drives a lot, okay? But you need transparency to do that, and I'm very strong on this, okay? And it applies to all markets, broadband ISPs, in all features of their business, not just network management. Network management seems to be really important to the Commission these days, okay, which is a matter of history, but I think we have to look at all. It also applies, in my view, or should apply, to application and content providers. Okay, they shouldn't get a free ride here. Okay, and backbone. We don't talk much about backbone networks, but they're in the game as well. and they influence what happens to customers. Okay? Once you get this, put your faith in customers to make the right decisions. You don't have to tell them what to do. They're smart, they can figure it out. But you got to give them the competition and you got to give them transparency. Don't even listen to professors, okay? We don't know what we're talking about. And I am very much a hawk on this. I really think customers need to be in the driver's seat, and we shouldn't be telling them what to do. There is, however, in transparency, a market failure. And it's a well-known one. It's why we have the Federal Trade Commission. It's why we have the consumer group here, and that is information asymmetry. It's been a well-known thing in economics. This is a problem. You have to make sure the customers have good information. And even in competitive markets, there may not be incentives for firms to reveal this. Okay? May or may not. I'm not saying, but definitely this is an area where regulation should at least be involved. Okay? And I'm a hawk on this issue. I think it has to be done right. Okay? But, the words I'm hearing around here are good. There's another implication, which is to say if there isn't a market failure, regulation is going to be worse than useless. And I'm a hawk on this as well. So be careful. There's got to be a market failure you're looking at. If it's not a market failure, regulation's all downside, no upside. Now, what do we mean by transparency? We've said it a few times. This is a familiar example to American consumers. Credible, decision-relevant information has to be made available. It has to be immediately and easily available at the time of purchase. Okay? It has to be easy to understand. This has also been mentioned. Not EULAs, not buried 3 deep on a website, does not require a JD to understand it. Now, I actually said this once to a JD who, and she had had a job for some period of time writing EULAs. And she said the job was to make sure even JDs didn't understand them. So there you are, little inside the sausage factory. This is the example. We know what it is. We see it every day in the supermarket, well, every week in the supermarket, which is the nutrition data label. Okay? It's on every single piece of packaged goods sold in the United States. It's a standard format, has the basic facts. You have to work hard to not see it. Now, some of us don't, but you pick it up and it's on the outside. Okay? Easy to see. Doesn't have everything, but it's got most of the stuff you need to know. An interesting case is the FDA, FTC prescription drug information, which gets at a point that was raised earlier, and that is to say the important stuff is on the label. Prescription drugs are at least as complicated as broadband, let me tell you. Okay? So you look at this thing and it has, do not operate heavy machinery. Okay? And it's got the important stuff right on the label. If you want to drill down, there's the package insert. Nice architecture for revealing information. I like it. Okay? We should be thinking about that. Going to name some principles for assessing disclosure. Does it provide all the information your customers need to make decisions? Does the customer have easy access? Is it clear and simple? And is it verifiable? Is it credible? Okay. What info to disclose? Use a reasonable customer standard. I mean, we have this standard, for example, in consumer law, the reasonable consumer. We have an investor law, reasonable investor for securities law. It's a fairly standard legal way to go about it, but here's the thing I really focus on it. Talk to consumers, talk to customers, see what they want. See what's important to them. We're all wonks up here, don't talk to us. Yeah, we all have opinions, but what matters is what customers want. So you should be doing what corporations whose livelihood depends on knowing what customers want. Use focus groups and talk to real people, not people that file stuff with the FCC. That's, you don't want us.
Sure.
Okay?
Could you wrap up maybe in 30 seconds or a minute?
I was hoping to talk less than Chairman Leibowitz. I'll do my best, okay? Incidentally, hint on this, network management may not be the most important thing on a customer's agenda. That's a working hypothesis, but wouldn't do it. Okay, let me quickly go through this thing. I'm not going to do this one. This is the performance measure, which I think is more important than network management. You can look at it later. Easy access. Application content providers. Adopt a standardized icon. Require it be on everybody's website. You roll over, it's got the easy stuff. Click it, it's got the more difficult stuff. Do the same thing with broadband ISPs. I'd like to see this in the sys tray in Windows. Okay? You can opt out of it. You may not want it, but it'll give you what you need to know. Okay? Right there. Okay? It can also be used to alert customers to botnet and attacks and stuff. Here's the third principle, clear and simple. This on the your left-hand side is credit card information label that's required. Can't read it? Most of us can't. Right-hand side was an interesting thing they published in the New York Times. Some design people came up and said, what would you really want to do? Okay, that's it. The other thing you should look at is financial reporting by publicly traded firms for the SEC, which would follow a reasonable investor standard. Fourth principle, verifiability. A number of ways to get this. The FCC does not have to be the ones that do it. You could have an ISO 9000 standard. You could have outside auditors. There's a number of ways to do this. Ofcom in Britain has come up with some interesting ideas about how to do this, in which they are very involved, incidentally. Okay. Lastly, this is a conclusion.
You're doing
it. Necessary condition for competition to lead to customer-centric outcomes. With competition and transparency together, customers get to make the decisions. That's where you want to be. Transparency is an important part of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Nicholas Weaver. He's a researcher at the International Computer Science Institute in Berkeley at the University of California at Berkeley, and he's one of the leading developers of Netalyzer.
Thank you very much. This is joint work with Vern Paxson and Kristen Private, also of ICSI. ICSI is it is on. Is this better? The switch is on and there is a red light. Should I turn up the audio level?
Yeah.
Testing, testing, testing. This better? Okay, good. I'm actually doing something very gutsy. I'm a technologist who's doing a live demo. To begin with, this is National Science Foundation funded research, but all opinions are my own, not those of the NSF. Our belief is we are strong network transparency hawks, but we believe in doing one better. We actually want to discover what's up on the network. So we've built a tool which is designed twofold, to create a wide-scale survey so that we can actually build nutrition labels for ISPs without even having to rely on the ISPs doing disclosure, and also as a tool for individuals so that they can find out if there's anything interesting on their network. It could be misconfigurations, it could be deliberate mismanagements, it could be something local to their system. And we try to be pretty much as comprehensive as possible within the limits of making it trivial to use. Making it trivial to use means it just runs in the web browser. So the user goes to our site, Netalyzer. We've had some 80,000 visits so far. Click the button. It goes to a back-end server, and they either allow or deny our signature. And while that's busy running away, checking a whole bunch of different properties, I'll show you what the results are. So this is a fairly typical network. What we do is we color code things, and we minimize stuff when it's green, and we have convenient explanations. But let's go through. This is from the Starbucks down the street. Starbucks, well, you're behind a NAT. Very common for hotspots. Most individuals are behind NATs. But this NAT doesn't renumber TCP ports. Not listed on any bad blacklists. What protocols are blocked in the network? Well, DNS is blocked because they use DNS to manage things so that you actually go through the hotspot login. This is a hotspot. You expect things like that. Likewise, on UDP, the DNS goes through a proxy. So we know you can't actually access anything raw DNS-wise, but at the same time, when we do direct access, the results are sensible. So it may proxy, but it's a correct proxy. There's no bugs on the MTU. There's subtle little bugs that have driven us crazy with networks dropping packets. Latency is good. No outages. Bandwidth is good. This is an interesting one. Network buffering. It turns out there's a design flaw in a lot of network hardware. It stores too much information. And as a result, what happens is things don't work right under load. You get things feeling slower than they should. This checks for it, and we found out that this is quite an endemic condition. As such, this is a case where you'd want really advanced traffic management techniques, because with advanced traffic management in the core of the network, you could fix this bug without having to fix all the buggy devices. Is there a in-path HTTP proxy or cache? No, there is not on this network. We checked over a large number of ISPs. Caching is not common in the US. We did not see significant US ISPs running in-network caches. We did see South African ISPs run in-network caches. And this makes sense because if they work correctly, this improves latency, reduces bandwidth cost, especially when you're out in the middle of South Africa trying to get to US websites. A big set of tests is DNS. So does the DNS system work right? Will DNSSEC work right? Works quite well. We do a lookup of a whole bunch of names on the client side, send them back, and do reverse on the server, because there's malcode that changes people's DNS settings. More disturbing, we saw at least one ISP that Wide Open West, which does not return a valid value for www.google.com. Instead, it returns the address of their own proxy. Examining this proxy server shows that it will proxy search.yahoo, but it will not proxy mail.google or www.yahoo. And deliberate invalid requests give a reference to phishingwarningsite.com, which is a nonsense domain as far as we can tell. So an ISP is deliberately manipulating DNS results, and we have no idea why. This is an example why transparency is important. This could be quite legitimate to protect users. It could be something completely illegitimate. And unless they disclose what they're doing, we have no way of telling. And this is discussed in more detail in my written remarks, which should be on the website. And finally, browser system clock, because those have issues too. But to give you an idea what more interesting networks are, this is what the hotspot looks like here. As you can see, there is a lot of red.
We have no more time right now.
The interesting thing
How do we let that slide get through?
This proxy also has a security vulnerability in this, so we report that to the user. Oops. And it caches data incorrectly. Caches are all fine and good as long as they work right. And so the lesson of this, that's just spurious. Ameritrade has bad reverse data a lot of times. The lesson of this is quite clear. It is actually in the ISP's interest to do complete, clear, concise disclosure, because it's going to be revealed by people like me anyway. But if you do disclosure in advance, it prevents these unfortunate surprises.
Thanks, Nick. We'll now hear from David Young. He's Verizon's Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and handles items before the FCC dealing with broadband and emerging issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. It's a real pleasure to be here today. These are important topics, and they're also complex topics, and I think the previous presentation demonstrates just how complex these issues can be. The internet is a complex ecosystem, and user experience on the internet is driven by the interactions of all of the elements of that ecosystem, whether it's the software on the device or the operating system, the hardware itself, or consumer electronic devices that are integrated, things that are going on in the home network or the corporate network, things that go on in the access network, and then things that go on the server side, the applications and content and things that are running on the internet. And all of these things together contribute to the experience that the end user has. And so robust disclosure of the things that affect that end user experience are very important. And so all of the participants in that ecosystem have a duty to provide robust disclosure about the things that affect that experience. Verizon does this for our own services, and we do it in a way that we think provides consumers with meaningful information that allows them to make informed choices when they're purchasing a product. At the point of purchase, we disclose all of the relevant information, and then after purchase, we provide a way for them to continue to get information that's relevant to their service and the things that affect their service. I think, though, an important point that's come up a lot today is the fact that consumers should have and do have tools at their disposal to verify what they're getting. And things like Nettalyzer are very detailed and provide a wide variety of relevant information. But there are simpler tools out there as well that provide pretty robust information about upload and download speed and latency, for example. Those tools also frequently show a consumer not only what the result is for their test, but how does that compare with other people who live in the same area or who use the same ISP. And so this is extremely valuable for them in figuring out, okay, how is my experience, but also in making market decisions as to what products and services they want to use. There are security tests that look for vulnerabilities not only within the network and in the path, but also on the individual's own system themselves, where frequently those vulnerabilities exist. And there's an ability to test for interference along the path. I think that third-party evaluation, and I talked about it in these tools that are available, but somebody who can look at and do side-by-side comparisons of these various things is useful to consumers. I think Consumer Reports provides a good model for that in sort of the real world. They do compare internet service providers, but to my knowledge, they haven't done any real technical comparative testing of actual performance and whatnot, and that would be interesting to see. Or something like Root Wireless it seems like an interesting concept as well for providing that sort of comparative information for consumers. Because this stuff is so complicated and it's not easy to convey to average consumers, and it's not clear what the best way of doing that is. I think that a process that allows all interested parties, whether it's service providers, content providers, consumer groups, academics, to come together and really look for what are the best practices. And this is the way techniques are developed in the IETF, for example, for the types of network management tools that are created for ISPs. They're the types of things that are discussed in groups like NANOG, the North American Network Operators Group, that actually apply these tools to practices. And I think that a similar approach for looking at what are the types of things that are best disclosed to consumers, how best to disclose them, and develop a set of best practices in this area with respect not only to network management practices, but to things like speed and performance and those sorts of things is absolutely the right approach. A group like that could also serve as a sounding board for new ideas so that bad ideas don't get implemented in the first place, and then for identifying bad actors out there that are not sort of complying with what's seen as best practices, because it's in the interest of the good actors, the people who are trying to do the right thing, to weed out the problems, to fix them themselves. And then if the industry and the shining sunlight on it is not able to fix those problems, then there's a role for government to step in as a backstop and deal with those things in an antitrust or FTC type approach. I'll let it go there and look forward to questions. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you, David. Next here from Fernando LaGuardia. He helps Time Warner Cable develop and advance its policy positions that focus on consumer protection, competition issues, intellectual property, and telecommunications regulation. Fernando?
Thanks. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Joel. Thank you, everybody, for allowing me the opportunity to be here. This is an important topic, and thank you also to my fellow workshop members and furiously taking notes here, listening to your good ideas about this important topic. Time Warner Cable's corporate mission is to connect people with information, entertainment, and each other, and to give our customers control in ways that are simple and easy. I think that lays out very clearly why we're interested in this topic. Our business success is entirely dependent on customer satisfaction with our services, and providing clear and comprehensive, usable information to our customers is essential to our success. That means giving customers the right information they need to control their broadband internet experience. Powerful incentives already exist to ensure that we do that, communicate clearly and effectively with our customers. We operate in a competitive marketplace. Our customers have ever-increasing expectations as to the quality, reliability of our services and their ability to control their experience. In addition to the oversight of the Federal Trade Commission and various states, we also have content application providers who also have the incentive and ability to monitor and ensure that what we are doing serves their customers, who are our customers as well. As a result, we pay very close attention to the clarity and efficacy of our customer communication efforts. We give our customers clear information at every stage of their relationship with us, from the selection of plans to customer care and billing to service termination. And we use a variety of channels to do that. They include web content, advertisements, in-person assistance at local offices, toll-free telephone lines, online chat, and email. And we continually refine our disclosure practices to make sure that they are simple and easy. We're particularly attentive to the practices in connection with the network management issues at stake here. There is near universal agreement that reasonable network management is essential to protect the online experience, and we've always maintained a practice of transparency with respect to our management practices. It's increasingly important in the competitive marketplace to do that. It's one of the many bases the customers have to make comparisons between their service providers and making decisions. As a result, we don't believe there is a need right now to codify transparency principles to ensure customers can make informed purchasing and using decisions. But if the Commission finds some form of consistency and disclosure would help consumers, then there is an opportunity, as has been referred to here, to work collaboratively on best practices to make that happen. The Commission has sought comment on the creation of a broadband clearinghouse to serve as a repository of broadband-related best practices and recognize the value of that type of resource. It would better serve consumers than the imposition of mandatory one-size-fits-all solution. If the Commission determines to mandate disclosure, we think two important points should be made. First, disclosure rules should allow flexibility to adjust to marketplace and technological conditions. This is an evolving marketplace. Everyone refers to the importance of innovation. Rigid disclosure mandates tend to produce boilerplate, as seen in the tariff model that prevailed for many years with regard to common carrier services. Second, users should have as much information as possible regarding the conditions that apply to their use of content and application and online services as they do to their broadband service providers. Search engines and others have the same obligation, and Professor Faulhaber made those points eloquently. If sunlight is the best disinfectant, as the Commission notes in the Mprm, then that sunlight should shine broadly on all parts of the Internet ecosystem and not be eclipsed in this important area. Finally, while transparency is important, the Commission should focus on the provision of information to consumers. I think that there's certainly been widespread agreement on this panel so far that the purpose of transparency is to empower consumers, and that should remain the goal. Imposing requirements upstream disclosure would be superfluous. I think the problems that have been referred to so far could certainly be discovered in disclosures to consumers, as well as they could be by imposing upstream mandates. And we believe that there are unfortunate consequences to security in the online experience if we make too much detail available to upstream providers beyond what consumers can understand. I think that summarizes my written comments, and I appreciate the opportunity to make them here to you.
Thank you, Fernando. Our final speaker is Joel Kelsey. There's Joel. He's a Federal International Affairs Policy Analyst for Consumers Union, which I'm sure most of you know is a nonprofit publisher of Consumer Reports. Joel?
Hi, thank you, Julie. And thank you to the Commission for the opportunity to testify today. I'd also like to just quickly note that the workshop couldn't be more timely, because if you're a subscriber or just a curious magazine rack browser, you'll notice that this month's issue of Consumer Reports is on bundled ISP providers, both cable, voice, and internet service providers. And there's also an editorial on network neutrality that you'll find on page 4 or 5. So as a magazine that seeks to give consumers access to truthful information necessary to compare goods and services, we very much value and support strong and enforceable government disclosure standards. And we believe that the Commission's on the right track. We were glad to see the Commission take a comprehensive approach to transparency in the Consumer Information and Disclosure NOI this past summer. And we're also very glad to see the addition of the 6th principle in the Open Internet Mprm. We have long comments that we filed into the record on the notice of inquiry this summer that I would refer folks to for things like truth in broadband advertising, truth in billing, actual versus advertised speeds, surcharges, fees, et cetera. For the next couple minutes, I'm going to focus just on network management practices, since that's what's mostly in the Mprm. And I'd like to cover 3 areas. First, I'll give the consumer perspective on what the current landscape of transparency looks like and the need for disclosure. Second, I'll touch on the perceived tension between clarity of information and detailed disclosure. And then last, I'd like to give 5 examples of what we believe meaningful network management might look like, and offer 2 reasons why we believe the Commission should expand, clarify, and broaden the language that's in the Mprm right now. So we very much agree with the Commission that transparency discourages harmful market behavior and that network management practices should be disclosed to consumers. This is especially true when limited competition constrains consumer choice and dilutes the incentives among providers to provide an accurate representation of the services being offered. Currently, broadband subscribers are confronted with confusing and often sometimes misleading information regarding service quality when making choices between providers. Internet access companies generally provide their subscribers with broad terms of service that give the flexibility to change their terms, their network management practices, and their level of service without any prior notice to their subscribers or to the public. And again, I'll point to my written testimony here and the many pages of appendices in the notice of inquiry this past summer that detail all of those different terms of service for many of the providers in the United States. As a matter of just good consumer disclosure policy, we believe the Commission should stop ISPs from describing binding terms and conditions within a multi-page legal document in 8-point font. In the context of an open internet, we believe that the disclosure of network management practices is particularly important for 3 reasons. First, it gives consumers, and we've all talked about this on the panel today, an accurate and ongoing representation of the internet experience that they sign up for. Second, it ensures that network management practices are narrowly tailored to address a legitimate purpose and don't unduly interfere with a consumer's access to a best efforts network. And lastly, it allows innovators and applications developers to make informed decisions about where to allocate their resources and how to design their applications. And I also will mention that we're hawkish. We're very hawk-like on making sure that content providers disclose relevant privacy information to consumers as well. And there's a great debate over at the FTC about that. Clarity versus detail. being at Consumer Reports, we very much understand and value the need for concise, clearly formatted, and easily understood information design. In fact, we very much pride ourselves on writing clear and concise reports that help consumers make marketplace decisions. And consumers must absolutely have access, both at the point of sale and in an ongoing basis, access to high-level information that plainly articulates factors like actual service performance rather than up-to speeds. And then also, they must have general criteria regarding when a provider may block, prioritize, or monitor service use. This information should be disclosed in a consistent manner across ISPs so that consumers can easily compare when they do in fact have a marketplace decision to make. And usually, as the chairman of the FTC mentioned, that's only between two folks, mostly their cable provider or their telco provider. However, the clarity of information provided is a question of information design, and it shouldn't be confused with the need for the Commission to issue requirements making thorough and detailed information about such practices available to the public. Consumers are empowered when they have more, not less, information on which to base decisions, and there's many organizations out there that will interpret that detailed information and try to give consumers access to unbiased opinions about what that information may mean for their end use, for their service, and for the end use experience that they have. And in practical terms, just because consumers don't understand technical network terms today doesn't mean they won't develop sophistication over time. It stands to reason that the vast majority of consumers weren't necessarily conversant with miles per gallon, caloric values, octane levels in gasoline, or APRs and credit scores before the federal government provided an industry standard and mandated consistent public disclosure of such information. So that leads us to, what does meaningful disclosure actually look like? And we have a couple recommendations for the Commission. We believe that the Commission should both require an easily accessed means for subscribers to learn about network management practices and how that might impact their end user experience, and then also disclose a more detailed, require a more detailed analysis on the purpose, the message, and the congestion levels that are necessary to trigger a particular network management practice. Here are 5 examples. First, any limits imposed on a subscriber's upstream or downstream traffic. This includes blocking, delaying, deprioritizing, or prioritizing, or inserting traffic into a stream. Second, technical details of the method that was used to impose a limit on the subscriber's traffic. Third, thresholds that trigger certain network management practices, and an estimate of the percentage of users that were affected and the duration of the practice. If the practice is only used during congestion periods, let folks know what the trigger for that was and when the network management practice may stop or cease. Fourth, any technology that inspects the content of internet traffic other than processing just basic addressing information. This would be DPI or deep packet inspection. Fifth, the differences in how the network is being allocated to different users, to different uses, including quote-unquote managed services. This includes the amount of capacity dedicated to general internet traffic, and if shared capacity, how that might be shared. Lastly, I'd like to urge the Commission to clarify the language in the Mprm for 2 reasons. First, subjecting disclosure to reasonable network management, we believe, provides some ambiguity. For example, one interpretation of that exemption could mean that reasonable practices need not be disclosed, and that ISPs would then be the judge of reasonableness, and they would only then have to be required to disclose information about network practices that they deem unreasonable or were therefore illegal. That's clearly not the intent of the Commission, and we believe that we could go a long way in the final order to get rid of that ambiguity that might lead to that circular logic. Second, disclosure obligations should not rest on the compliance of other consumer protections in the Mprm in particular. It's just not clear based on the language in the Mprm what falls under the umbrella of the 6th principle. That is, what actually requires disclosure. We believe that the Commission shouldn't attach the requirements of disclosure to other consumer protections, but should craft disclosure principles as a standalone requirement and look at it in a different tract related to all of the many marketplace reasons that you identified in the NOI this summer, and make sure that it applies both to wireless and wireline providers. With that, I'll wrap up and thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Fantastic set of presentations. What we'll do, we'll take about a 6-minute, 30-second break, and we'll resume at 20 of 4. We should have the cards in the back. Have we got somebody designated to pick them up? Who's going to? Okay, right over here. So make sure you get your questions in. Email questions to newmedia@fcc.gov. And I gave out the Twitter information, and look forward to the closing hour. Thanks. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you all for your presentations. This is really a very terrific and very thought-provoking session. I think both for anyone who's new to the subject and for those who have been trying to puzzle through all of this for a while. Julie and I were just talking at the break. I think we each have a few questions that we'd like to ask that I think are fairly general questions that would be very helpful to get some perspective from all of you. And then I know we have questions both from the audience, from people following this online, and we will certainly leave plenty of time for anybody here to ask their questions as well. But I wanted to just start with, I think, this whole question of reasonable and unreasonableness. And I think both to offer a little bit of a clarification, but then also to ask some questions that I'd love to hear your take on. So just to clarify what the sixth principle actually says, what this principle says is that subject to reasonable network management, providers of broadband access have to disclose information concerning network management and other practices to enable users, content application, and service providers to know what they need to know. So this is, I think, potentially a little bit hard to follow because we're using network management in a couple of different contexts here. And the intent here is that providers should disclose any information about their network management practices that would be of importance to consumers or other users, but that disclosure in itself is subject to, quote, reasonable network management practices, meaning, for example, that it would never be expected that a provider would disclose information that would somehow compromise the security of the network. So hopefully that's a little bit clarifying. But the question that I think this raises, because several of you talked about this kind of reasonable, unreasonable standard, I would be very curious as to what your thoughts are on, first, what are the basic kinds of things about network management that you think consumers and other users need to know to make intelligent decisions about how they use the network or what network they choose? And second, what would be, in your view, some important exceptions to that rule that would be important to, to not disclose for valid reasons? And Mr. Chairman, I thought actually, if you don't mind, it might be very interesting it would be very interesting for us to hear if these are issues you addressed and how you addressed them in your process.
Yeah, we did. We first of all obligate ISPs to clearly and prominently do things on their website. And they have to be, and they have to make references to disclosures in relevant marketing materials, customer contracts, or terms of service. So if you as a customer look at it and you want to find there's a reference there, so you know where to go to them. Secondly, the way we broke it down, I have here the actual decision. It says, who is affected by the ITMP? When the ITMP management will occur, so you know exactly the time period, what type of internet traffic, i.e., application class of application protocol will be subject to it, how the ITMP will affect the user's internet experience, including the specific impact of speeds. And that's really the person. What does it mean to a consumer? You have to put it in normal English so the user can understand this means I will slow down, interrupted, I can't view, etc. And then secondly, we also made sure that in advance 30 days, and not only new ones, but also amendments to existing ones, say significant ones. And of course, we specifically exempt housekeeping ones, or as you suggest, with your reasonable standard, anything that would impair the security of the network, would give away information that could be used to harm the person.
And you're finding that distinction is one that the networks are reasonably comfortable with, but that also is getting people the information they need in your judgment.
It's the early days. I mean, it's only in since November, but basically everybody says, yeah, I think you've hit the main points. We will now see as we get complaints and delve into them, and we'll obviously have to elaborate, put some flesh on these concepts, etc. But by and large, people think we have covered the main areas.
Terrific, thank you. Anybody else have a comment or a question on that point? Yes, Nicholas, yeah.
I think there's sort of also the need for two levels of disclosure. There's the high-level view for generic users and the more detailed view. So like, let's take an advantage of a policy I actually like as a customer is Comcast's fairness mechanism. A high-level description could be, this enforces an approximate fairness between users on timescales of 15 minutes. Nice, sensible, high-level description of what the goal is. And then the detailed is, it operates by this thresholding of congestion and QoS metrics and stuff like that, so that I, as a detailed expert, can go, okay, the high-level description actually matches what's on the wire, and that this is how I test for it, or this is why this is so subtle in practice I'm not going to bother testing for it. So there's, I think, two levels of disclosure that's needed on a lot of things, the normal disclosure and the geek disclosure.
Is that a term of art or? Great. Anybody? Thank you. Very helpful. Yeah, Sasha. Yeah.
I just wanted to add to this. Security through obscurity is a fascinating and easy way to undermine the basic fundamental security of your network. And so I'd flip it on its head. I'd say, there is almost nothing that shouldn't be disclosed because that's what maximizes the network security. Now, in terms of what should you exclude, I don't know, like passwords to servers and things like that. But other than that, it's like if you're doing something, chances are people can identify it and have the tools to do that. And if you're blocking ports or forwarding ports or doing, DNS proxying, all of that stuff should be disclosed. And there is almost zero times where it would be a good idea for security reasons not to disclose that.
I strongly disagree when it comes to parameters rather than techniques. I believe that every ISP should do some outbound heuristics on port 25 and dynamic blocking. And we see a lot of this. This is a good thing. But I don't believe ISP should disclose the thresholding involved and the detailed algorithms involved, because those can be used to game the system. Likewise, the high-level description of the Comcast fairness is they're fuzzy on the parameters. The parameters are within this range, which means I, as an expert, can validate that this is what the general concept will do, but I, as a evil person, would have a real trouble gaming the system. So I think there should be a distinction between techniques and detailed parameters in terms of disclosure.
Wouldn't you want to do that on, I don't want to geek out too much and lose everyone, but you'd want to do that at the servers, that, like the SMTP servers, not on the network itself?
No, on the network itself, because you want to allow people to contact arbitrary SMTP servers so they don't have to use the ISP's SMTP server when their notebook moves from work to home to this. But at the same time, you don't want them able to run spam bots. So a lot of ISPs are doing heuristics that if you only contact one SMTP server and don't send too much, you allow it. But if you start contacting too much, it gets dynamically blocked.
Joel, you had a comment.
One just quick. Sorry. One just quick comment is that, so a lot of this turns around what the commission whatever the commission decides will look like its reasonable network management test. And so, and then decide to kind of go forward on what's reasonable and what's unreasonable based on complaints that are brought before the commission. So from our perspective, we'd very much like to err on the side of disclosure, because then consumers will know whether or not they see a management practice that they'd like to bring a complaint before the commission or not. And then the commission can employ its test. And we've been huge fans of not listing black hat and white hat practices, but instead general criteria that kind of give consumers, internet service providers, and innovators at the edge an idea of what would be deemed reasonable or not in the final order. And then
reasonable for providers to do you mean?
Right. What would be a reasonable network management practice versus an unreasonable network management practice. And based on what that criteria looks like, one practice in a certain circumstance might be reasonable, but then in a different circumstance, it might be unreasonable. For example, on wireless or wired networks, and different, I'm sure you can come up with 1,000,001 different examples of how a particular network management tool might in one case be okay, but in another case not. So very much erring on the side of disclosure. I also very much like the idea of having a, kind of simple format for most consumers to be able to look at and figure out how it's going to impact their actual internet experience, and then a much more detailed disclosure maybe on a website or kept in a folder online on the FCC's website for consumers to access, that folks like Consumer Reports, New America, and others can go and look at.
Sure. Jay.
Just, I think this is partly the same point, and that is that if the standard is narrowly tailored, which we believe is an appropriate, striking the appropriate balance, there needs to be enough information to make for, if not a consumer, then one of the helpful organizations to make that evaluation. By the way, for the record, we believe that the term strict scrutiny has come up, and I believe the strict scrutiny standard is actually narrower, because it to me implies that there is one least restrictive means of doing it, and anything else would be unreasonable. We appreciate that there are different ways of doing network management, but given that the means chosen should be narrowly tailored to minimize the negative impact on traffic or content or whatever the case may be. Also, I just wanted to note that while it's great that there are businesses, even startups, that are in the business of analyzing information and disclosing it for consumers, much of the information that we probably would want to see is not easily available. It may be available only anecdotally initially. We've tried some data collecting practices ourselves and found out it's quite difficult, and it's hard to get very broad data. So I think those outside groups are critically important, especially in the comparative analysis between competitors. But the starting point of the information has to be coming from the providers themselves, who have the best data and the broadest data.
Great. Thank you. I know we do want to get on to questions that we've been getting, but thank you. I think that was a good one to open this up, and let's continue with more discussion.
Just to follow up on the same line, what are the areas with the development of the new measurement tools that you can't get at?
Detailed fairness and congestion policies that only occur under congestion. Those you can really only measure with long-term baseline monitoring, so where you have measurement agents distributed on a lot of computers. On the other hand, those policies, even when screwed up, are less disruptive towards users. So the more subtle the policy is, the harder it is to measure, but the less likely it's going to have a significant effect on a large number of users.
Anybody else? Gerald?
Let me raise a point which we haven't talked about. I think David Young mentioned it, which is to say, what are we going to hold broadband ISPs responsible for? Because certainly the latency, the issues that I run into depend as much on the fact that I'm still using an untweaked version of Windows XP, which has real limitations in its IP stack. So I'm never going to buy Comcast 50 megabits because I can't run at 50 megabits. Because of my system. I don't know that. Somebody had to tell me that. So that means the people we need to hold responsible, we need to hold, let's say, Comcast responsible for stuff that goes on only in their network. But that is not the whole customer experience, and somehow we got to close that gap.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and one we may want to talk about a bit more. We have some questions.
Okay.
Okay. So the first question from someone here today, I'll just read this verbatim. NSF net stats were cited. Those used application-specific measures which involve essentially DPI. Do panelists believe, then, that DPI should be used in broadband measurement? And Sasha, I think you were the one who talked about NSF net initially, so start us on that. If you would.
That's incorrect. I mean, there was passive measurement. There's still passive measurement. A lot of this was actually used by, there was a time when ports and applications mapped much closer onto one another. And so that was used as a heuristic for collecting these. I'm not, utterly familiar with the data collection methodologies from 15 years ago. I know that, and this is the important part, there were processes in place by which these methodologies were constantly evolving. And that certainly should be a part of what is implemented by the FCC. You don't want to say, like, this is the end-all and be-all for all time. You want to have a process by which, you can add new metrics as, octane becomes important, that becomes something that is disclosed at the pump. And we want that equivalent for what's happening, on broadband connections as well.
Good. Okay. Yes.
Oh, wait. Also,
sorry.
DPI is almost never a good idea, just because it creates data obfuscation on the behalf of the users. So, no, I don't think that would be a good solution to this problem.
Fair enough. Thanks.
I think, speaking as a network security person, think DPI has been much and needlessly maligned. It is actually very useful for a lot of things, including network measurement. But it really, for network measurement and the like, it tends to be only appropriate on non-ISP networks. But on the other hand, you can use measurements conducted at universities, companies, et cetera, to probe the other end. So this is what we did with the reset injection stuff, is we monitored our own traffic to probe the other side. There are real cases where the ISPs should be using DPI. Like, to be honest, would anybody object to the network recognizing this is known spam sent from known spam bot X, cut off this person's network until they're fixed? Notify them, clean them up. That's an example of DPI use that's very, very benign. On the other hand, you've got DPI use like some of the ad injection schemes, which I find totally nauseating. So for network measurement, however, most of the stuff you want is actually lower level. The packet timing and passive analysis is often far, far more useful unless you suspect that a network is specifically discriminating against one class of traffic or another. And then you'd have to use DPI to validate that that's what they're doing. But until then, mostly just headers are sufficient. Also, NetFlow alone is a huge source of information.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Again, just following on that same line, what about the responsibilities between the application providers and at the other end? So, for example, I've got the transmission information, and then I've got the application information. Should it be the responsibility of the application provider or a filter you put, for example, on your PC to deal with the spam or viruses that come in on content, or is that the responsibility of the ISP, or should it be up to the consumer to opt in or not? Thoughts on that?
Did you clarify that question?
Yeah, in other words, I think the point that Nicholas was getting at is that if your ISP is getting into the packets and identifying the content and looking for spam or viruses, I mean, I've heard some folks say, no, that shouldn't be within the realm of the ISP. That leave that to the filter you put on the PC. So are there, yeah, okay.
I think the ISP ISP could ask the customer, do you want us to do this? Because there's a lot of things that are done better in the, I mean, I know this is end-to-end heresy, but there's a lot of stuff that you can do in the network which is going to be done better in the network. And I think this might be, at least some of this, one of them. But transparency says, ask the customer, do you want us to do this?
Also, there's a directionality involved. That stopping stuff coming into the customer system is best done on the customer system. Stopping bad stuff coming out of the customer system has to be done in the network due to just simply how rootkits work.
Well, I think from the wireless space, I mean, the carriers control everything from certification of the radio modules on the device to certification of the hardware platform when it's done, even to certification of some of the applications that runs on there. I mean, you look at Apple and iPhone as an example. I mean, they have very strict regulations on what kind of applications can be provided on that device. Even though some of the applications aren't malicious, if you're not using certified APIs that they allow you to use, that application will not run on that platform.
Until somebody figures out a way to correctly identify what is spam in my inbox and what is not, I don't want anyone without my consent having the opportunity to drop email that they may consider spam and I may consider vitally important. And I think that's fundamental. This is why you have an end-to-end network architecture, is that you want to empower the edges of the network to make decisions over this. Now, in terms of the opt-in, I don't see anyone anywhere ever saying that people shouldn't be able to provide services or applications to end users.
But
If it's as an opt-in.
as an opt-in,
As long as
absolutely.
it's
disclosed. If you forgive me for one more question, and this is for Chairman von Finkenstein. So the rules have been in place and parties have started to disclose their practices. Is this up online now that folks can look at? And I was just wondering if anybody has taken a look in Part B of the question, whether there's any disclosure provisions you see anybody doing out there that you think would be a great model?
No, I haven't seen a great model. It is up. They are all up now. And we have a very live secondary market because we mandate secondary ISPs to be able to purchase bandwidth at a mandated price. And so there is the internal industry monitoring, especially the secondary ISPs very carefully monitor what the primary ISP puts on its website because it affects them directly and want to make sure that's fully disclosed, etc., and etc. And as I say, so far we have not received a single complaint or suggestion that we should look into something that somebody is not following up. But as I say, it's early days. But I count very much on those, on intermediaries, consumer groups, but also those secondary ISPs to make sure that the system is honest and people do what they're mandated to do.
Okay, Jerry?
Heard from some of the ISPs here. Transparency is in a good situation now, particularly with broadband ISPs, because I think many of the broadband ISPs, seen what happened to Comcast. They've got religion on this, okay? They know this is coming. They know they have to get with the program. And I think this is a good time for a cooperative solution to work with these guys. I'm not at all convinced that the application and content providers are anywhere near that degree of willingness to accept transparency. But I think the broadband ISPs are, and I think that's a great opportunity for the Commission to look into something which is a much more cooperative venture with their guidance, but nevertheless something where you can tap into the industry expertise on this, as well as from, pardon the word, pundits and academics.
Very good. Yes, and thank you. Very, very good point also.
Do one of these?
Yes, so why don't you take that one?
The Internet's end-to-end principles put the management of a connection into the end stations. TCP, HTTP, and other session protocols operate in the user's PC and the content server. Transparency must include these parts of the system. The question, I'm going to take the liberty to modify it, says, will the FCC include end-to-end vendors? I'll change it to, should the FCC include end station vendors in the process? Thoughts on that? Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
As someone who's looked at the Nettalizer stuff for the NATs, oh Lord, I'd love a hammer to get the NAT vendors to cooperate, but I don't think a regulatory system would help given the number of vendors, low cost, etc. I don't know what is the role of mandating that end systems actually apply the standards they're supposed to apply.
I would take a different tack on that, and it's not so much that a regulatory approach is going to change that, but I think the end systems providers do need to be involved in the process of how you develop these practices, what the best practices are, what the effect of not complying with those practices are on the customers of these devices, and that that dialogue between all the different players in that ecosystem is beneficial and should prevent the types of problems that people are concerned about. Now, you can't bring everybody to the table, and there are going to be people who take shortcuts, and hopefully the market will weed those people out. But I think that it is vitally important to have all of the various pieces of this value chain represented in the process.
I would agree. It was a little horrifying to hear someone suggest that here's yet another thing the FCC should regulate. I thought you proposed quite a lot of regulation in this NPRM, but the notion of bringing these folks into this process from a transparency perspective, I think David's right on. I think you absolutely have to do that.
Sasha. Yeah.
Let me add to this, and this sort of intersects with what Jerry was saying earlier, that the best metrics and measurement tools are going to measure end to end, or at least end to the center, and therefore you will empower customers to identify when their operating system is actually the bottleneck as opposed to the ISP's network, or when the router at the home is the bottleneck. Or you want to empower end users to identify whether it's their application, their home network, their ISP, or something unknown. And that kind of flips on its head the notion of you need to bring everyone into the room, but rather says you should be in the room, and if you're not, just know that you will be held responsible if you guys are the ones that are messing around.
Sasha, MLabs, as I understand it, does have at least one of the packages that tries to distinguish.
Yeah, the network diagnostic tool actually does exactly what I'm saying. And so Jerry would have gotten a response to his test that said your buffer on your operating system is the reason why you can only get up to 10 megabits per second. And until you change that, then it doesn't make sense to get, Verizon's 50 megabits per second package.
Yeah. And that actually, I'm sorry, Jerry, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask you a question. I was on MLabs about 6 weeks ago looking for the data, and I couldn't find it, which means maybe your website, you didn't have it, or your website wasn't transparent enough to tell me where to get it. Is it there now?
Yes, it's actually stored on Amazon. There are links from the page. I think you have to go to the Get Involved section or something like that. Yeah, Amazon's providing us with free hosting of the 500 gig data set.
So it's not on MLabs then?
Well, we don't have 500 gigs to store the data
But that's
locally.
not where to look for it?
To the link.
On your website?
Yeah, the link
Okay.
to the data is on the website.
Okay.
Great. Actually, we have another specific MLabs question.
Okay.
Would MLabs consider opening up to transparently involve researchers from the Internet Research Task Force?
Absolutely, absolutely. We have an open system whereby those that want to be involved just contact us. You can be involved. Those that have tools that want to host on MLab can contact us and have our tools. The source code is all open source. We're all about, finding new people and partners that want to be involved in this.
Terrific. I have a question I'd like to ask on the format of disclosure and consumer information that I think actually relates to some of what we've just been talking about. So we've seen a few different examples and models in this discussion about how information can be can be disclosed and shared with consumers, and they range from a kind of nutrition label for broadband to the kinds of things that Root Wireless is doing, where you really have, as I understand it, very localized maps of coverage in different areas. And I think one of the interesting questions here, and this may relate more to things like broadband speed, but may also relate to network management practices, is that there are so many variables, that what you experience at home is determined not only by what the ISP does, but also by the computer you have, by things that may happen more locally, and in other ways as well. And I would love to get a little more discussion of where do you think we are on the spectrum between nutrition label and local mapping or wireless coverage? Which of these, or is this problem more similar to, or is it somewhere in the middle? Or does it depend, Nicholas, as you said, whether you're at the general level or the geek level? Yes.
We actually have a history here, okay? And one of the things we've learned is in things like networks, which are subject to lots of random variability, okay, depending on what other people are doing, and are time dependent. Are you getting on the network when everybody else is, which is when it really matters? And we had in the old telephone world a way to deal with this. We said the probability of blocking is 1%. Now it's a probabilistic, during the busy hour. It's probabilistic, time dependent. It's more complex with the internet, with broadband ISPs, but you can say things like, in your neighborhood or your city or something, you name the aggregation, at your service tier, okay, customers have received at least 10 megabits download speeds, 3 megabits upload speeds during the busiest hour of the week. Stop. Notice it's a probabilistic statement. Anything you make, any statement you make in this business without probabilities on it is wrong. I can guarantee you that. Okay? It has to be place specific, has to be busy hour specific, but you can do it. It's doable.
Great. Ron?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with what Jerry said there. In fact, if you look at where Root Wireless has really been spending a lot of their time over the last year, has been just on this issue. I come from an engineering background, and I continually fight with some of our marketing people that the information we've been presenting is on the geeky side. We've gone through many variations of how we present the information. In fact, one of our partners, CNET, who's going to be posting the information from us, presently right now has a pretty good investment of trying to make this information so it's very easy for the end consumer. On that notion, there's also people that want to dive deeper into these details. So having some kind of a progressive disclosure that up front, if somebody can get their information that they want very quickly, can get in, get out, make their decision. But if different people want to get to different layers, they have the capability of being able to dive down deeper.
Great. Thanks. Pearl, maybe, because you made some comments about this too, just what your thoughts might be on the kind of information that would be provided to consumers.
And are you talking about formatting or specific?
The formatting and the...
Well, I agree with some of the comments that have been made here that there might be some thought put into maybe something more high level for people who just want a generic idea of what's going on in their system and something more detailed. But I think it's important to have the detailed information available to people who want it. But I do like the idea of something more high level and more generic for those who may not have or may not want the specific detailed information.
Good. Maybe we could also I'd like to hear from the service providers as well, Fernando and David, your thoughts on this. I mean,
I think it's an excellent topic because, to Jerry's point, in order to do this, it's not a one-time test that you would be using. You have to collect a statistically valid set of data, and that is going to provide a host of information about average, median, and various distributions of those tests. And all of that tells you something about the user experience or the probable user experience on a particular service. And so I think having a group of people who are interested in this topic, the service providers, the consumer groups, the consumer
people who understand how consumers process information and focus groups perhaps, but bringing these people together to come up with what are the right ways of analyzing this data and communicating it to consumers is absolutely the right approach, and trying to do it through sort of a notice and comment process is probably not going to get to where we want to be.
I have to agree with that. I'll echo it, not to be boring, but because I think it's right that this is something that, in order to really ensure, to paraphrase Dr. Seuss, that someone is speaking for consumers, then we need to collaborate here and cooperatively work on best practices, because otherwise what's going to happen is we're going to end up with a process where the outcome either is static, short-sighted, or ignores the average consumer as opposed to the geek. And I think that's important. And I also would say there's a lot of work that has gone into, certainly at my company, and I believe at others, but I've experienced it by going to our site, explaining to customers in an intelligible way the various aspects and attributes of the different service plans that we offer in ways that are simple and easy, as is our mission. What types of applications can be used, what kind of demands you can put on your service. I think those are ways that customers understand it, that are friendly, and that we're best suited to intermediate, because that's a role that we play very positively, and I think our consumers, our customers, subscribers react positively to that because they use the service. But I do think in the marketplace where there are different providers, there are application vendors, there are others, it's very appropriate and in fact necessary to come together. And in terms of where we are on this dynamic or this spectrum between, a simple box, this all the way up to securities disclosures, I think we're definitely not at either extreme. We want to get to a place where information is easier for customers to understand. That's certainly in the interest of providers. But I don't think we're at a point right now where those definitions will have meaning to ordinary subscribers without some more work and cooperation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I would say there is clearly going to be an educational component to this as well as a disclosure component. So, Joel, yes.
Just 2 quick points. One is that process is absolutely, I think, very important in bringing, various different folks around a table to discuss, what can and should the commission do, and where might it err on the side of caution is important. But I think it shouldn't take away from the impetus or the need for the commission to feel like it has to act here. When you ask where are we on the spectrum, and I'll get away a little bit from speeds and focus more on network management practices here. And you can kind of go through our submissions in the docket and also in my testimony. But the examples in the terms of service are, we may suspend your account, take any other action to prevent from. I agree that you may suspend my account, take any other action to prevent me from utilizing certain account privileges, for example, home pages, or cancel my account without any prior notification. I agree you may suspend or cancel my account from using any or all part of the service to post content to the internet or to engage in peer-to-peer file exchanges or other forms of file exchanges that violate the agreement of terms of use. Full stop. So, I don't want to take away from the need of networks or ISPs to manage their networks, but there needs to be some criteria there to let consumers know when they may get blocked or shut off or kicked off a network, when they may not be able to access a home page, when they may not be able to participate in peer-to-peer file sharing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And we're talking, I think, about a couple of different kinds of issues here, because we are inevitably going back and forth between performance issues and network management issues, because I think the consumer experience is both in a kind of a meld. But I would say that in addition to clarity, and Fernando, this is what I was really kind of responding to and what you were saying, I think we should not underestimate whether it's the provider who does it or Consumer Reports who does it or the FCC who does it. We should not underestimate the need to really educate people about what this all means, as well as giving them data, because I think there probably is an understanding gap, because these can be fairly complex issues. Yeah.
Had a question that came in over the internet. What would happen if the commission merely adopted 2 rules, one requiring transparency, and another prohibiting anti-competitive conduct and enabling competition. Reactions? Would that be sufficient? Yeah, Jim.
No. Enabling competition, I'm not sure what the questioner meant by that, but I think the commission has to take, I'm sympathetic with that point of view, okay? The commission has to be much more proactive in enabling competition. And my particular view here is wireless broadband and getting a lot more spectrum out. That's an absolute fundamental, has to happen. It's the only thing we're going to find, in my estimation, where we're going to see competition in the broadband market, and we can begin to let the market take care of itself. Transparency, absolutely essential. Enabling competition, absolutely essential, but the commission has to do something about that, and frankly, you got to do it quickly.
Others?
I'm
Jay?
going to chime in and say no as well. When the commission looked at the Comcast practices, some commentators said that this is really something that's more appropriately handled by the FTC. And my concern then and my concern now is that not every network management practice that hurts me as a competitor actually rises to the level of being a competition violation. Or it may be very difficult for me to make that case, or extremely expensive for me to make that case here above the Chinese restaurant in Palo Alto. So I think having some rules about what the standard is for permissible practices, as well as a way to understand what they are, is critical. And I, by the way, I think that the allusions to, or the specific references to sort of a two-tiered view where there's sort of a simple consumer, the thing that consumers mostly want that's more the nutrition label at one level of sort of disclosure, and then the rest of it that's more like the prescription insert, because what's in the insert is what those of us are going to want to see who are going to evaluate. Is this a practice which is, one, hurting me and something that's permissible? The consumer may just care about, am I going to be shut down, or is my speed going to be slowed at dinner time? So I think approaching those as one pile of information but two levels of disclosure in terms of the way it's displayed is probably a good way to think about it.
Great. Do we have more questions from the audience or from ourselves?
Well, I have one.
Please, go ahead.
Wireless, which many folks point to and say, well, that's different. How should we think about wireless in terms of disclosure? I know Canada treated wireless a little bit differently. Would the label look the same, but the information might have more variability to it? And thoughts on that?
So
yeah, go ahead.
Just as important in the wireless arena, and Verizon Wireless makes an effort to disclose what a customer will reasonably expect to get when it uses our 3G or 2G data services, and I would expect that we would have similar disclosure as we roll out our 4G LTE. So I think the principles are the same, and that's that consumers have a need to know this information, and providers have a vested interest in giving them the information that they need.
Great. Yes.
I think on the topic of wireless, if we're talking either fixed wireless or mobile wireless, there's one of the additional features when you start looking at mobile wireless, there's that wear factor. You know, if my intention is to buy a device or that I'm going to use in multiple different locations, I need to have that additional piece of information to know that, hey, when I travel to these other areas, what am I going to expect to see in those areas? I think you also see a little bit larger dynamics, and some of this can go to Jerry's point, where we've got some spectrum issues in here. You go to downtown San Francisco at 12 o'clock noon as compared to downtown San Francisco at 12 o'clock midnight, you're going to see wildly disparate types of service in there.
Yeah. Yes, Jerry.
That mobility issue, I think, is very, very important. There are certain dimensions that wireless stretches that wireline does not. And I think the other thing we see, because of mobility and other factors, Wireless traffic's a lot more bursty, okay? And that means making probability statements is even more important. It really is a different space. My analogy, and this is why it concerns me a little bit about regulation here. What it looks like we're trying to do is regulate these same things the same, because we say, well, you know, it's wireline, wireless, what's the difference? And I have the feeling this is a little bit like the 1930s when we decided, well, we're regulating railroads, why not regulate trucks? Disastrous decision. They are very different, even though they're about carrying traffic. I have the same concern about this Mprm. These are very different businesses, even though from a customer's point of view, they're both carrying traffic. But if we try to regulate them the same way, I think that's a bad decision.
I have to just jump in real quick and say, you know, I think from a consumer point of view, it's a real head scratcher that the same opportunities shouldn't be afforded to you on your PDA accessing the internet as on your laptop plugged into a wall. And so, you know, I absolutely think we need one national framework for both ways to access the internet. I think that, and I couldn't agree actually with David more, that the principles are the same, right? The principles here are the same. And so you're looking at the entire Mprm, if you get the discrimination piece definition right, if you get the reasonable network criteria correct, then regardless of whether it's a wireless or a wired network, and you may have to take different factors into account based on how you're judging the network management principle, but as long as the test is correct and the discrimination definition is right, then I think the Commission has the ability to do that in a way that makes sense for consumers. When it comes to the world, you know, leaving the network management world and going into the consumer world of wireless, I think, you know, it's a little bit more nettlesome or a harder nut to crack, because you have things like switching costs or early termination fees, things like locked handsets that stop consumers from being able to take the device that they've invested hundreds of dollars in from one network to another. You have things like pricing that's much different than it is in the wired world. 20 cents for a text message after you go over your limit, or however much per kilobyte after you go after your data limit. And all of those things, I think, need to be disclosed to consumers in a way that they can actually understand, so that they don't experience sticker shock once they get their $500 bill because their daughter went over the texting limit.
And that gets us, I think, a little bit more into the territory of the general notice of inquiry that we put out last August.
That's
on
correct.
Disclosure. I see a couple of hands here. I think in order it was David, Nicholas, and Sasha, and then I think we're at about at a wrap. Yeah.
I think I need to make it clear that when I talk about the principles being the same, my position is that this is not an appropriate area for regulation, and that the appropriate way to deal with it is with an industry best practices. I think that wireless has actually set a good model out there with CTIA's consumer code. And I think that can be built upon. I think it provides a good model for the wireline broadband industry to look at as well. And so I just want to make that very clear, that I think the principles are the same. I think that the value to consumers is important. I think that we all have an interest in providing that information and doing it in a way that's most meaningful to consumers. And I don't think that a regulatory process is the best way to get there.
Just a couple thoughts as just a random consumer. I actually think there's a difference between regulation on disclosure versus regulation on behavior. I think conceptually they're very similar on disclosure requirements. We want the same thing, but behavior is a completely different bailiwick. Like I would, if I was a wireless provider, I would be so cracking down on peer-to-peer because of the differential costs. The other thing that I think comes into play in terms of disclosure is there needs to be, if there's ever a case of variable pricing, so pricing per usage, there needs to be a way for a consumer to impose a ceiling on total cost per month, and there should be a default ceiling of total cost per month that is some fraction, like 2x, 3x, 4x the base cost. And when you exceed that ceiling, you're cut off rather than run up the bill. It's just why that isn't out there, I don't know. That's the reason why I don't have a Droid phone. That's a reason why I don't have a mobile broadband card, is they don't have that mechanism built into the system in a way that I know of.
Fair enough. And Sasha?
Sure. Well, I will just kind of sum up, which is that consumer empowerment needs three things. It needs disclosure of service levels and guarantees that you as a consumer, you need to know what it is that you're buying. It needs documentation of on-the-ground realities, i.e. what's actually happening in people's homes across the country. And it needs accountability for providers that promise one thing and deploy or give consumers something else. And you only get there, you only get to that kind of a consumer-empowered reality with government oversight.
Okay. Well, on that note, I want to thank all of the panelists, thank the audience, thank the people who've joined us online. I think this has been a very, very remarkable session, really, and I know from our point of view, I think you've all brought perspectives and insights that I think will be very helpful to us as we continue on this path. I do hear, certainly a lot of issues that need thought and discussion and working through, but as you heard our commissioners and our chairman say at the very beginning, we do feel there's a lot of common ground beginning to emerge, and I think part of our role is to really foster that as well.
Well said. Just join Joel in thanking all of you. It was a great afternoon, and stay ready in case we get back to you for more questions. Thank you.